Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that has quietly haunted the mountains of Northern California for more than 4 decades. A story about a tiny resort town called Keddie, population barely 100, tucked into the Sierra Nevada along a winding stretch of State Route 70. A place where the pines grew tall and the cabins grew old, and the nearest real grocery store was a 20-minute drive through canyon roads. And in the spring of 1981, inside one of those cabins, something happened that the community, the investigators, and the surviving family members have never been able to put behind them. Not because it was unsolvable, but because, at nearly every turn, the people responsible for solving it either failed or chose not to. Now, dim those lights. Turn on a fan for that steady hum of white noise. Get comfortable. Maybe pull the blanket up a little closer, because tonight we're going to be here for a while, and the story we are walking through deserves patience. It deserves care. These were real people. A mother who gave up everything to protect her children, a teenage boy who was just starting to figure out who he wanted to be, a young man who happened to be in the wrong place, and a 12-year-old girl who vanished into the night and was not found for 3 years. Have you ever wondered what happens to a community when a crime this violent goes unsolved? Have you ever thought about what it does to the children who survive, who grow up carrying the weight of something they were never supposed to witness? Have you ever considered how many cold cases might have been solved if the right people had simply done their jobs? Tonight, we're going to find out. Let's start at the beginning. To understand what happened in Cabin 28, you first need to understand where it happened. Because Keddie, California, was not the kind of place that made the evening news. It was not the kind of place that appeared on maps unless you were specifically looking for it. It was a speck of a town in Plumas County, nestled in the steep, forested terrain of the northern Sierra Nevada, about 150 miles northeast of Sacramento. The kind of place where the nearest hospital was in Quincy, 6 miles down the canyon. The kind of place where the general store doubled as the post office. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. And that was supposed to be a comfort. The town had been founded decades earlier by a railroad surveyor named Arthur W. Keddie, and for a time it had been something of a destination. The Keddie Resort, which sat along the canyon near the Feather River, had once been a fashionable retreat for city dwellers looking to escape into the mountains. There was a lodge with a restaurant and a bar, cabins scattered through the trees, and the kind of quiet that only comes from being genuinely far from everything. Fishermen came for the river, hikers came for the trails, families came for the silence, but by the late 1970s, that era was long over. The resort had faded. The restaurant still served food and the bar still poured drinks, but the clientele had shifted from vacationers to locals. The cabins, once rented by the week to tourists, were now rented by the month to families who could not afford much else. Students from nearby Feather River College, railroad workers on low wages, single mothers stretching welfare checks as far as they could. The paint was peeling, the plumbing was unreliable. The glamour, such as it had been, was gone. Picture the resort in early 1981. You're standing on Keddie Station Loop Road, looking at a cluster of small wooden cabins. They are old and they are close together, separated by narrow patches of dirt and gravel rather than proper yards. Some of the cabins have porches, some do not. The windows are small, the walls are thin, Sound carries in ways you do not expect. Behind the cabins, the land slopes down toward the railroad tracks and the river below. In front, the road curves past the lodge building and the general store. To the north, the mountains rise steep and thick with pine and fir. To get anywhere, you need a car, a ride, or your thumb. There is one road in and one road out. The population of Keddie at this time was somewhere around 60 to 100 people, depending on how you counted. Some lived in the resort cabins year-round. Others lived in small houses nearby. There was a boarding house where a few Feather River College students stayed. There were families with children, retirees who had simply never left, and a handful of people who had come to Keddie because it was cheap, because it was remote, because no one asked too many questions. Which is to say, it was a place where people landed when they did not have many other options. The cabins were laid out in a rough line. Cabin 28, where the Sharp family lived, was in the middle of the block. Right next door, in cabin 27, lived the Seabolt family. James Seabolt Sr. and his wife Zunita had several children, including a son named Jamie and daughters named Elisa and Paula. They were friendly with the Sharps. The children played together. The families looked out for each other in the way that neighbors do when the nearest town is a winding canyon drive away. Across a narrow lane called Spanish Oaks, directly in line with cabins 27 and 28, sat cabin 26. And cabin 26 is where things get complicated, because cabin 26 was home to a man named Martin Smart, his wife Marilyn, Marilyn's two sons from a previous relationship, and a friend of Martin's named Severin John Bubede, who went by the name Bo. Martin Smart was in his early 30s. He was a Vietnam veteran who had struggled with his mental health for years. He was known to be volatile. He drank heavily. He had a temper, and he lived, quite literally, steps away from the front door of cabin 28. Now, the fact that these cabins were so close together matters for several reasons. First, because it means that whatever happened on the night of April 11th, 1981, happened within earshot of multiple occupied homes. And second, because the proximity of the suspects to the victims would become one of the most frustrating elements of the entire investigation. The people who most likely committed these murders did not have to travel. They did not have to drive. They walked across a narrow lane and they walked back. But we will get there. For now, just hold that geography in your mind. A tiny cluster of aging cabins in a mountain canyon, pine trees and railroad tracks, a bar down the road, one way in, one way out, and families living so close together that you could hear your neighbor's television through the walls. Let's talk about the woman who lived in cabin 28 to fully understand the world that Sue Sharp moved her family into. You need to understand what rural California was like in the early 1980s. Not the California of movies and television, not the beaches of Malibu or the skyline of San Francisco or the glamour of Hollywood. The other California, the one that stretches from the Sacramento Valley up into the high Sierras, where the highways narrow to 2 lanes and the towns thin out until they are little more than a gas station, a post office, and a handful of houses pressed against the side of a mountain. Plumas County, where Keddie sits, was and remains one of the least populated counties in the state. In 1981, the county had roughly 20,000 residents spread across 2,500 square miles of mountain terrain. Quincy, the county seat, had a population of a few thousand. It had a high school, a hospital, a few restaurants, a few bars, and the modest infrastructure of a small mountain town that served as the hub for an even more remote surrounding area. You are standing in Quincy on a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1981. The main street is quiet. Pickup trucks are parked in front of the hardware store. The Elks Lodge, where Sue Sharp sometimes worked, is down one of the side streets. Feather River College, where Sue and the Smarts attended their typing class, sits on the edge of town. The air smells like pine sap and wood smoke and the particular mineral clarity of mountain river water. From Quincy, you take the road west toward Keddie. It is about 6 miles winding along the canyon cut by the Feather River. The road is 2 lanes, paved but narrow, with guardrails in some places and nothing but a steep drop in others. In winter, this road can be treacherous. In spring, when the snowmelt swells the river and the rain turns the unpaved shoulders to mud, it is merely unpleasant. But it is the only way in or out unless you are willing to hike through miles of dense forest, which is to say, it is the only way. The Keddie Resort, when you arrive, does not look like a resort in any modern sense of the word. The lodge building is large and somewhat imposing, a wooden structure that speaks to a grander era. But the cabins, the dozen or so small structures scattered around the property, are modest at best. They are wooden frame buildings, single-story, with shingled roofs and small windows. Some have porches, some have basements. Most have 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a single bathroom. They were built for vacationers who expected a rustic charm, not luxury. And by 1981, rustic charm had curdled into simple disrepair. The resort had changed hands over the decades. Different owners had tried different approaches. For a time, the cabins were vacation rentals. Then they became more permanent housing for locals who needed cheap rent. By the late 70s, the resort was a mix of year-round tenants and the occasional short-term renter, all living in cabins that were slowly settling into the ground. There was no homeowners association. There was no property manager in any meaningful sense. The cabins were what they were. If something broke, you fixed it yourself or you lived with it. The doors did not always lock properly, which is why many residents simply did not lock them. The walls were thin enough that you could hear conversations from the next cabin if the windows were open. Privacy was more a concept than a reality. And yet, for the people who lived there, it was home. The children played in the woods and along the creek and on the railroad tracks that ran behind the property. They walked to school or caught a bus into Quincy. They knew each other. They ate at each other's tables. They watched each other's children. In a place this small and this remote, community was not optional. It was a matter of survival, which makes what happened in April of 1981 not just a crime, but a betrayal. Because the violence came from within the community, from people who lived there, who were known, who were neighbors. And when the investigation failed to produce accountability, the betrayal compounded. The community that was supposed to protect its members had failed to do so. The authorities that were supposed to seek justice had failed to do so. And the survivors were left to carry the weight alone. Let's talk about the children more, because the children are the heart of this story. Glenna Susan Sharp was born on March 29th, 1945, in Springfield, Massachusetts. She went by Sue, and by the time she arrived in Keddie, California, In the fall of 1980, she had already lived through enough hardship to fill several lifetimes. Sue had married a man named James Sharp, and together they had 5 children. John, the eldest, born November 16th, 1965. Sheila, born in 1967. Tina, born July 22nd, 1968. Rick, born around 1971. And Greg, the youngest, born around 1976. For years, the family lived in Connecticut, and for years, the marriage deteriorated. James Sharp was, by most accounts, an abusive husband. There were allegations later corroborated by family members and investigators that he had also been sexually abusive toward his own daughters. The details of what Sue and her children endured in that household are painful to consider, and we will not dwell on them here beyond acknowledging that they were real and that they shaped everything that followed. In July of 1979, Sue made the decision that so many survivors of abuse make and that so few receive credit for. She left. She packed up her 5 children, left Connecticut, and headed west. Her brother Don Davis lived in California, near the Quincy area, and Sue moved to be closer to him. The family first settled into a small trailer at the Claremont Trailer Village in Quincy. It was cramped. 5 children in a single wide trailer is exactly as tight as it sounds, but they were free. They were away from James, and for the first time in years, Sue could breathe. Imagine being Sue Sharp in the fall of 1980. You are 35 years old. You have 5 children ranging in age from 4 to 15. You have no husband, no reliable income, and no safety net beyond your brother and whatever the state of California will provide. You receive a small stipend from the Navy, though the details of why are not entirely clear from the available records. You qualify for food stamps. You take part-time work at the Quincy Elks Lodge. You enroll in a California Education Training Act program and begin a typing class at Feather River College, hoping to build skills that might lead to steadier employment. You are doing everything you can. That November, the family moved from the trailer in Quincy to Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. The cabin was larger than the trailer. It had 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a partial basement. The previous tenant, interestingly enough, had been Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Douglas Thomas himself. The cabin was far from luxurious, but it was home. Sue and her youngest daughter Tina shared the rear bedroom. Rick and Greg, the 2 youngest boys, shared the front bedroom, which sat right next to the living room. John, the eldest of 15, took a small, unfinished room in the partial basement. It was not ideal. The room could only be accessed from the outside, and the cabin had only 1 bathroom upstairs. But John, being 15 and wanting the kind of independence that 15-year-old boys want, did not mind. He would use the back staircase to come up to the main floor when he needed to. The family kept the doors unlocked so he could move freely between the basement and the rest of the cabin. This detail, the unlocked doors, would later prove significant in ways that no one in the family could have anticipated. Now, despite the cramped quarters and the tight budget, the Sharp family found something in Keddie that they had not had in Connecticut. Community. The children made friends. Rick tried out for baseball at Gansner Field in Quincy. Sheila became close with the Seabold girls next door. John befriended a boy named Dana Wingate, a 17-year-old who also attended Quincy High School. Tina, who was 12, was social and well-liked. Greg, the youngest at 5, was just a small boy doing what small boys do in a mountain town with trees to climb and a creek to wade through. Sue, for her part, got to know the other residents of the resort. She became friendly with the Seabolts in cabin 27. She also knew the Smarts across the lane in cabin 26, at least in passing. Martin and Marilyn Smart were also enrolled in the typing class at Feather River College, which meant Sue saw them regularly. Whether she and Martin Smart were ever close is a matter of some dispute, but what is clear is that the families were aware of each other. In a place as small as Keddie, it would have been impossible not to be. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to start over in a place where you know almost no one? To uproot your children from everything familiar and transplant them into a mountain town where the winters are cold, the nearest city is hours away, and your entire life fits into a rundown cabin at a faded resort? Sue Sharp did that. She did it because the alternative was worse. And for 5 months, from November of 1980 to April of 1981, it seemed to be working. The children were settling in. Sue was building skills. They were poor, yes. They were isolated, certainly. But they were together, and they were safe. Or so they believed. Let's talk about the other people who lived at the Keddie Resort, because the cast of characters surrounding Cabin 28 would become central to everything that followed. Martin Smart, as mentioned, lived in Cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn, her 2 sons from a prior relationship, and his friend, Bo Bubede. Smart was a Vietnam veteran who had been honorably discharged but who carried deep psychological scars from his service. He was known to drink heavily, and when he drank, he could become aggressive and unpredictable. His marriage to Marilyn was troubled. There were arguments, there was volatility. Smart had been in and out of counseling, and at least one counselor would later come forward with claims that Smart had made deeply troubling admissions during their sessions together. Bo Bobede was a different sort of figure entirely. His full name was Severin John Bobede, and he had at least 2 known aliases, Bobby Lake and John DeSantis. He was in his 50s at the time of the murders. He had known connections to organized crime in Chicago. How exactly he ended up in a rundown cabin in a mountain town in Northern California is not entirely clear, but the fact that a man with mob ties was living a few dozen yards from a single mother and her 5 children is the kind of detail that feels too dark to be coincidental. The Seabold family in Cabin 27 was by all accounts a stable and decent family. Sonita Seabold was the matriarch. Her son Jamie was a teenager. Her daughters Alisa and Paula were close in age to the Sharp girls. They were the neighbors you would want to have, the kind who would take in a child for a sleepover without thinking twice about it. And then there were the children. Justin Smart, Marilyn's son, was 12 years old and a friend of the younger, Sharp boys. On the night of April 11th, 1981, Justin was sleeping over at Cabin 28, as he had done many times before. To be fair, there is nothing inherently suspicious about a 12-year-old sleeping over at a friend's house in a small town. Children did that. Children do that. But Justin Smart's presence in Cabin 28 on that particular night, and the conflicting stories he would later tell about what he saw and heard, would become one of the most agonizing threads of the entire case. So here is where we are. It is April of 1981. The Sharp family has been in Keddie for about 5 months. Sue is working part-time, taking classes, raising 5 children on her own. The children are making friends, going to school, playing in the woods. The resort is quiet. The bar is open. The trees are budding. The mountains are still capped with snow from the winter. And on Saturday, April 11th, something shifts. Something that had perhaps been building for weeks or months or longer finally reaches its breaking point. And by Sunday morning, 4 people will be dead. A 12-year-old girl will be missing. And the lives of everyone in this small community will be changed in ways that can never be undone. Let's walk through that day. Sue was born Glenna Susan Davis on March 29th, 1945, in Springfield, Massachusetts. She grew up in the Northeast. She married young, as many women of her generation did. She had 5 children over the span of about a decade. She lived in Connecticut with her husband James, and the marriage was, by all accounts, unhappy from relatively early on. James Sharp was abusive. The details of the abuse are not extensively documented in the public record, but they were significant enough that Sue eventually made the wrenching decision to leave. In 1979, she packed up her 5 children, ages roughly 4 through 14, and moved across the country. She left behind everything she knew, her home, her extended family, her community, and she did it because staying was worse. Think about the courage that requires. In 1979, domestic violence resources were far less developed than they are today. Shelters were scarce. Legal protections were limited. The social stigma of leaving a marriage, of being a single mother on welfare, was far more intense than it is now. And Sue had 5 children. 5. Finding housing, employment, and stability for a family of 6, with no support from the absent father, in a state 3,000 miles from where she started, is a monumental undertaking. Sue did it anyway. She moved first to the Carolinas, then to California, drawn by the presence of her brother Don Davis in the Quincy area. She settled into the trailer park first, then into cabin 28. She took whatever work she could find. She worked part-time at the Quincy Elks Lodge. She enrolled in the education program at Feather River College. She received food stamps and a small stipend. She made do. People who knew Sue described her as selfless. She was the kind of mother who would make sure her children had warm coats for winter, even if it meant she went without one herself. She put her children's needs ahead of her own. She sacrificed comfort, convenience, and personal happiness for the sake of her kids. Was she a perfect mother? No parent is. Some accounts suggest that because she was working multiple jobs and attending classes, she was not always physically present. But her absence was not neglect. It was necessity. She was doing what she had to do to keep her family afloat. She was earning money. She was building skills. She was trying, in the face of extraordinary difficulty, to create a better life for her children. And she was doing all of this alone. James Sharp did not provide child support. He was not part of their lives in California. Sue was a single mother of 5 in a remote mountain town, earning barely enough to survive. And she was making it work. Day by day, week by week, she was making it work. Until the night of April 11th, 1981, when everything she had built was destroyed. The cruelty of Sue Sharp's murder is compounded by the trajectory of her life. She escaped one dangerous situation, an abusive marriage, only to be killed in another. She moved her family to a place she believed was safe, and the danger followed her. Or rather, it was already there, living in the cabin across the lane. She did everything right. She left the abuse. She protected her children. She started over. And the world, in its casual and merciless way, punished her for it. That is not justice. That is not fate. That is simply the terrible randomness of violence, the way it finds people who have already suffered more than their share, the way it takes from those who have the least to give. Sue Sharp deserved better. She deserved to see her children grow up. She deserved to finish her typing class and get a steady job and build the stable, safe life she was working toward. She deserved to grow old and to see grandchildren and to know that her decision to leave James, the hardest and bravest decision of her life, had been worth it. She did not get any of that. She was 36 years old when she died. John Sharp was 15 years old when he died. 15. He was a student at Quincy High School, where he had enrolled after the family's move to California. He was, by all accounts, a typical teenage boy. He liked hanging out with his friends. He liked having his own space, which is why he had claimed the unfinished room in the basement of cabin 28, even though it meant using the outside stairs to get to the bathroom. He had a best friend, Dana Wingate, and the two of them did the kinds of things that teenage boys in small mountain towns do. They hitchhiked to Quincy. They went to parties. They explored the area. They were young and restless in the way that 15 and 17-year-olds are, full of energy and uncertain about where to direct it. John had moved from Connecticut to California with his family. He had left behind whatever friends and routines he had in the East. He had started over in a place where everything was new and unfamiliar. The landscape, the people, the rhythm of life. And he had done what resilient children do. He adapted. He made friends. He found his footing. He was building a new life, one that would never get the chance to fully unfold. Dana Wingate was 17. He was John's friend from Quincy High School. He was not a member of the Sharp family. He was not a resident of the Keddie Resort. He was simply a boy who came over to hang out with his buddy on a Saturday night. He had hitchhiked with John from Quincy that day. He had been given a ride by Sue Sharp, who had picked them up along the canyon road. He had spent the afternoon in Quincy and returned to Keddie in the evening. Dana's death is particularly tragic because of its randomness. He was not the target of the attack. He was not connected to whatever grievance or motive drove the killers. He was collateral damage. A boy who happened to be in the wrong cabin on the wrong night. His family, the Wingates, lost their son to a crime that had nothing to do with him. A crime that he could not have anticipated or avoided. Think about that for a moment. Your 17-year-old son goes to a friend's house for the evening. You expect him home the next day, and instead, you receive a phone call telling you that he has been bound with tape and beaten to death in a cabin in the mountains. There is no warning. There is no explanation that makes sense. There is only the incomprehensible fact that he is gone. Tina Sharp was 12. She was the middle child in some ways, not the eldest or the youngest, not the only girl or the only boy. She occupied that particular space in a large family where you are old enough to understand the difficulties of your circumstances, but too young to do anything about them. She shared a bedroom with her mother. She went to school. She played with the other children at the resort. She was part of the community in the unremarkable, everyday way that children are part of communities. On the night of April 11th, Tina had briefly visited her sister Sheila at the Seabolt house next door. She returned to cabin 28 She went home, and sometime during the night, after the violence began or while it was still happening, she was taken, not killed in the cabin with the others, but removed, carried away. The killers took her because she had seen them. She could identify them. And so, at 12 years old, Tina became both a witness and a victim, and her fate was sealed by the simple fact that she was awake or conscious at the wrong moment. The discovery of Tina's remains 3 years later, 62 miles from home in the woods near Feather Falls, confirmed what everyone had feared, but no one had wanted to accept. Tina was dead. She had been dead, almost certainly, since that night or shortly after. She had been killed and her body had been transported to a remote location and left there, left in the woods, in the dirt, in a place where no one was likely to find her. The fact that she was found at all, by a man collecting bottles, was a matter of chance. And then there were the survivors, the 3 boys in the bedroom, Rick, 10, Greg, 5, Justin, 12, 3 children behind a closed door, sleeping or lying still, while 4 people were being murdered in the next room. What did they hear? What did they know? These questions have haunted the case for decades. Rick and Greg, as members of the Sharp family, were the victims' brothers and son. They were young, especially Greg at 5, and it is possible, even probable, that they slept through the entire event. Young children are heavy sleepers. The bedroom door was closed. The violence, while extreme, may have been muffled by walls and doors enough that the boys did not wake. Or if they did wake, they may have been too frightened to move, too paralyzed to open the door, too young to understand what was happening. Justin Smart's situation was different. He was 12, older than Rick, and significantly older than Greg. He was the stepson of the prime suspect, and his accounts of the evening changed over time. Initially, he said he slept through everything. Later, he described a dream in which he saw his stepfather and another man in the cabin. Under hypnosis, he provided descriptions that were used for the composite sketches. Whether these descriptions reflected real memories, implanted suggestions, or the confusion of a traumatized child is impossible to know with certainty. Justin was in an impossible position. If he witnessed the murders, he was a key witness against his own stepfather. If he did not witness them, his testimony was unreliable. If he was coached, manipulated, or pressured by family members, then his statements were tainted. No matter what the truth was, Justin was a child who had been placed, through no fault of his own, at the exact intersection of family loyalty and criminal justice. And the system that was supposed to protect him, the same system that was supposed to protect the Sharp family, did not know what to do with him. Saturday, April 11th, 1981, started like any other day in Keddie. The sky over the Sierra Nevada was clear. The air was cool as it always is in the mountains in early spring, carrying that particular crispness that comes from melting snowpack and pine resin. The Sharp family had plans, the ordinary kind that families make on weekends. Around 11:30 in the morning, Sue, Sheila, and Greg drove out from the home of their friends, the Meeks family, toward Quincy. They were picking up 10-year-old Rick, who had been at baseball tryouts at Gansner Field. Along the way, they happened upon John and his friend Dana Wingate hitchhiking along the canyon road. The 2 boys had been headed to Quincy themselves, and Sue gave them a ride. She drove them back to Keddie, dropping them off at the resort. It was an unremarkable moment. a mother giving her son and his friend a lift home. The kind of thing that happens 1,000 times a day in small towns everywhere. A couple of hours later, around 3:30 in the afternoon, John and Dana hitchhiked back to Quincy. They were seen in the downtown area. There may have been plans to visit friends, to hang out, to do the things that teenage boys do on a Saturday afternoon when they have nowhere in particular to be. The details of where they went and what they did during those afternoon hours are not fully documented, but by the evening, both boys had returned to Keddie and to cabin 28. Now, as the day turned to evening, the various members of the Sharp family and their circle dispersed to their usual spots. Sheila, who was 14, had plans to spend the night at the Seabold house next door in cabin 27. This was not unusual. Sheila and the Seabold girls were close, and sleepovers between the two cabins were a regular occurrence. Sheila left cabin 28 shortly after 8 in the evening and walked the few steps to cabin 27. Sue stayed home. With her in cabin 28 that evening were the two younger boys, Rick and Greg, and their friend Justin Smart, the 12-year-old son of Marilyn Smart, from cabin 26. Justin had come over to spend the night. At some point during the evening, Tina, who was 12, briefly went over to the Seabold house to see her sister. She returned to cabin 28 before long. She was home. At some point that evening, John and Dana also returned to cabin 28 from their afternoon in Quincy. The exact time of their return is not precisely established, but they were home before the night was over. So let's pause here and account for everyone inside cabin 28 as the evening of April 11th settles in. Sue Sharp, age 36, is home. Her son John, 15, is home, likely in his basement room or upstairs with his friend. Dana Wingate, 17, John's friend, is there as well. Tina, 12, is home, probably in the bedroom she shared with her mother. Rick, 10, is in the boys' bedroom with his younger brother Greg, 5, and their friend Justin Smart, 12. Sheila, 14, is next door at the Seabolds. That is 7 people inside cabin 28, 3 in the boys' bedroom, likely settling in for the night. Sue, John, Dana, and Tina elsewhere in the cabin. Sheila safely next door. Now imagine this scene. You are standing outside cabin 28 on a Saturday night in April. The air has cooled considerably. The stars are visible in a way they never are in a city because there are no street lights and no light pollution. The resort is quiet. A few lights glow in cabin windows. Down the road, the bar in the lodge is open, and there are a handful of people drinking, as there are most Saturday nights. The sound of the Feather River is faint but present, a low murmur beneath everything else. Inside cabin 28, the lights are on. The evening is winding down. At some point, the phone is taken off the hook. Whether Sue did this herself or whether someone else did it later is not known. But the phone is off the hook. The lights, at some point, are turned off. And this is where the timeline becomes murky, because what happened next inside that cabin happened in darkness, and the only people who know the full truth are the people who did it. Here is what investigators were later able to piece together based on evidence from the crime scene, witness statements, and the limited forensic analysis available in 1981. At some point late on the night of April 11th, or in the very early hours of April 12th, at least 2 people entered cabin 28. The doors were unlocked as they typically were, to allow John to move between his basement room and the upstairs. There was no sign of forced entry. The intruders came in quietly enough that the 3 young boys in the front bedroom did not wake up. Or if they did not come out. Sue, John, and Dana were attacked in the living room. They were bound with medical tape and electrical cords. They were beaten with a claw hammer. They were stabbed with at least 2 knives. The violence was extreme. The walls and furniture were covered in blood. The attack was not quick and it was not clean. It was sustained. It was vicious. And it involved multiple weapons and, almost certainly, multiple assailants. 2 bloodied knives and a hammer were left at the scene. Blood spatter evidence from inside the cabin indicated that all 3 murders took place in the living room. This means that Sue, John, and Dana were either in the living room when the attack began, or they were brought there. The bindings suggest that at least some of the victims were restrained before they were killed. The combination of blunt force trauma and stabbing suggests a prolonged assault. This was not a home invasion gone wrong. This was not a burglary. Nothing of value was taken from the cabin. This was personal. And while this was happening in the living room, 3 young boys were sleeping in the bedroom next door. Rick, 10, Greg, 5, Justin, 12. The bedroom door appears to have been closed. The boys were not harmed. They were not touched. They slept through the night, or at least that is what was reported. And when they were found the next morning, they were physically uninjured. The fact that 3 children slept through the murder of 4 people in the next room is one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. The walls of cabin 28 were thin. The living room was directly adjacent to the boys' bedroom. The violence was extreme enough to leave blood on every surface. And yet, the boys heard nothing. Or, in the case of Justin Smart, claimed to have heard nothing, at least initially, before later offering a very different account of the evening. There is one more detail about that night that deserves mention. A couple living in cabin 16, which was not immediately next door but nearby within the resort, later told investigators that they had been awakened at approximately 1:15 in the morning by what sounded like muffled screaming. They did not investigate. They did not call the police. In a remote mountain town in 1981, strange noises in the night were easy to dismiss. An animal, perhaps. A domestic argument at the bar. Nothing worth getting out of bed for. And there is the matter of the green van. Several witnesses, including members of the Seabold family, recalled seeing an unfamiliar green van parked near the Sharp house at around 9 o'clock that evening. The van was not identified. Its owner was not found. It appeared, and then it was gone. A ghost vehicle at the edge of a crime scene that would not be discovered for another 12 hours. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, was not among the dead in the living room. She was not in her bedroom. She was not in the boys' room. She was not anywhere in the cabin. Tina was simply gone. Taken from the house sometime during or after the murders, carried into the night by whoever had done this. A 12-year-old girl vanished into the darkness of a mountain canyon with one road in and one road out. And the night closed over Keddie like a hand around a throat, and no one knew. Not yet. Let us walk through the evening of April 11th one more time, slowly, because the timeline of that night, pieced together from witness statements and physical evidence, reveals the methodical nature of what was done. The late afternoon and early evening unfolded in the ordinary rhythms of a Saturday in Keddie. By around 5 or 6 o'clock, the families at the resort were settling into their evening routines. Supper was being prepared or eaten. Children were moving between cabins as they always did. The bar at the lodge was open, and the early evening crowd was beginning to filter in. By 8 o'clock, Sheila Sharp had crossed the few yards from cabin 28 to cabin 27 for her sleepover with the Seabold girls. Her departure was routine, unremarkable. She said goodbye to her mother. She walked next door. She did not know that she would never see her mother alive again. Inside cabin 28, the evening settled in. Sue was home with Rick, Greg, Justin, and at some point Tina, who had briefly visited the Seabolds and then returned. John and Dana had returned from Quincy at some point during the evening, though the exact time of their arrival is not precisely established. By 9 o'clock, according to witness accounts, an unfamiliar green van was seen parked near cabin 28. Who was in the van, where it came from, and where it went remain unknown. Across Spanish Oaks Lane, in cabin 26, Martin Smart and Beau Boubed were doing what they apparently did most evenings: drinking. They made at least one trip to the backdoor bar at the lodge. Smart may have called the bar earlier to complain about noise. The visit to the bar may have been calculated, intended to establish their presence in a public setting at a known time, to provide an alibi for what was to come. Or it may have been genuinely casual. The distinction is important, but unresolvable. At some point after midnight, or in the very early hours of April 12th, the killers moved. They left cabin 26. They crossed the narrow lane. They entered cabin 28 through the unlocked doors. Whether they entered through the front door, the back door, or both is not established, but the unlocked doors gave them easy, silent access. Inside, the cabin was dark. The lights had been turned off, either by Sue as she went to bed, or by the killers upon entry. The telephone was off the hook, either taken off by Sue or by the killers. The younger boys were in their bedroom, door closed, sleeping. Tina was somewhere in the cabin, possibly in the bedroom she shared with her mother. The attack began in the living room. Whether Sue was already in the living room when the killers entered, or whether she was pulled or lured there, is unknown. But the living room is where the violence occurred. John and Dana were also in the living room, or were brought there. They may have been sleeping in the living room, as teenage boys sometimes do when a friend is staying over. They may have been watching television. They may have been awake and talking when the killers arrived. What happened next was fast and brutal and involved multiple weapons. The victims were restrained with medical tape and electrical cords. They were beaten with a hammer. They were stabbed with knives. The combination of methods, binding followed by blunt force trauma followed by stabbing, suggests that the killers were intent on ensuring that their victims could not escape or fight back, and that they were killed with finality. Sue was 36. John was 15. Dana was 17. They were bound and helpless, and they were beaten to death in a small living room in a cabin in the mountains. The violence was extreme enough to leave blood on every surface of the room. It was extreme enough that the killers left weapons behind, perhaps because the weapons were too damaged or too covered in blood to be usefully carried away. At some point during the attack, or immediately after, the killers became aware of Tina. Perhaps she was awakened by the sounds. Perhaps she emerged from the bedroom. Perhaps she was in the living room when the attack began. Whatever the circumstances, Tina saw the killers. She saw their faces, and that sealed her fate. The killers did not kill Tina in the cabin. They took her. Whether she was conscious or unconscious, alive or already injured, they removed her from cabin 28 and transported her away from the scene. The absence of her blood in the cabin suggests that she was not seriously injured before being removed. The distance to where her remains were eventually found, 62 miles, suggests that she was transported by vehicle. The couple in cabin 16, roughly 50 yards away, were awakened at 1:15 in the morning by what sounded like muffled screaming. If this was the sound of the attack, then the murders occurred in the early hours of April 12th. If it was the sound of Tina being taken, then the attack had already ended by that point. Either way, the screaming was brief enough and muffled enough that no one investigated. No one called the police. The night closed in again, and silence returned. The killers returned to cabin 26, or they drove away in the green van, or they did both, one returning on foot and the other driving. The specifics of their departure are unknown. What is known is that by morning they were back in their lives, preparing their alibis, adjusting their stories, acting as if nothing had happened. And in cabin 28, 3 young boys slept on or lay awake in terror behind a closed door. And in cabin 27, Sheila slept unknowing, a few feet from the worst night of her life. Sunday morning, April 12th, 1981. The sun rises over the canyon walls and spills into the Keddie Resort. The air is crisp. The birds are doing what birds do. And at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp walks the short distance from cabin 27 back to her family's home in cabin 28. She was coming home to change clothes for church. Try to imagine, if you can bear it, what happened next. Sheila opens the door. She steps inside, and what she sees in the living room of her family's cabin is something that no human being, let alone a 14-year-old girl, should ever have to witness. Her mother, Sue, is there. Her brother John is there. His friend Dana is there. They are covered in blood. They are bound. They are not alive. Sheila did not stay. She could not stay. She turned and she ran. She ran back to cabin 27 to the Seabolts, the only safe place she knew. She was screaming. Sonita Seabolt, the mother of the Seabolt family, took Sheila across the narrow lane to cabin 25, where the landlord lived. The Seabolts did not have a telephone in their cabin, so someone had to physically go to the lodge to report what had happened. At 8:05 in the morning by dispatch records, though some accounts place Sheila's discovery closer to 10, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office received a call from Jan Albin, co-owner of the Keddie Resort. She reported the possibility of a homicide in cabin 28. While the crime was being reported, Sonita's eldest son, Jamie Seabolt, went back to cabin 28. He went around to the back of the cabin, to the boys' bedroom window, and he knocked. A face appeared in the glass. Someone was alive in there. Jamie helped pull the 3 young boys out through the bedroom window. Rick, 10 years old. Greg, 5 years old. Justin Smart, 12 years old. All 3 were physically unharmed. They had been sleeping, or so it appeared, and they had no visible injuries. Jamie then did something that, while understandable, would later complicate the investigation. He briefly entered the cabin through the back door to check whether anyone inside might still be alive. He saw the bodies. He saw the blood. He saw enough to know that no one in that living room was going to be helped. But in doing so, he potentially contaminated the crime scene, tracking through evidence, touching surfaces, moving through spaces that should have been preserved exactly as they were. To be fair to Jamie Seabolt, he was a teenager in a moment of absolute crisis. He was not a trained forensic investigator. He was a boy who lived next door to a family he cared about, and he went in to see if he could help. That is a deeply human thing to do. But in the context of what followed, every small compromise of the crime scene would compound into something much larger. When deputies from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office arrived, they found a scene of staggering violence. The living room of cabin 28 was destroyed. Blood covered the walls, the floor, the furniture. The bodies of Sue, John, and Dana bore evidence of beating, stabbing, and strangulation. 2 bloodied knives and a hammer were recovered from the scene. The victims had been bound with medical tape and electrical cords, which suggested a degree of premeditation. Whoever had done this had come prepared. They had brought restraints. They had brought weapons. They had known what they were going to do. And then the investigators noticed what was missing. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, was not in the cabin. She was not in her bedroom. She was not outside. She was not at the Seabolts. She was gone. Vanished. Taken from the cabin during or after the murders and carried away into the night. An immediate search of the surrounding area was initiated, but Keddie is surrounded by dense forest, steep terrain, and miles of wilderness. Finding a child or a body in that landscape is nearly impossible without significant resources and luck. Tina was not found that day. She would not be found for more than 3 years. Now, here is where the investigation began to go wrong. And it went wrong almost immediately. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office in 1981 was a small, rural department. They were not equipped to handle a quadruple homicide. This was, by most accounts, the most violent crime in the county's history. Sheriff Doug Thomas recognized this quickly and called for assistance from the California Department of Justice in Sacramento. 2 special agents, Harry Bradley and P.A. Krim, were dispatched to Keddie. But here is the first red flag. Bradley and Krim were not from the DOJ's Homicide Division. They were from the Organized Crime Unit. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a bureaucratic mix-up. The homicide guys were busy, so the organized crime guys were sent instead. But investigators who later reviewed the case found this detail deeply suspicious, especially in light of the background of one of the suspects, Severin John Bo Bubede, Martin Smart's friend and housemate in cabin 26, had known connections to organized crime in Chicago. The fact that the DOJ sent organized crime agents rather than homicide specialists to investigate a mass murder in a remote mountain town has led some to wonder whether the DOJ had a prior interest in Bubed, and whether that interest might have complicated or even compromised the investigation from the start. Evidence collection at the scene was, to use the most charitable word available, inadequate. This was 1981, before DNA collection and processing became standard practice at crime scenes, which did not begin until around 1985. But even by the standards of the time, the handling of the Keddie crime scene was poor. An unidentified fingerprint was recovered from a handrail on the back stairs of the cabin. it was never matched to anyone. A second bloody knife was found in the trash bin behind the Keddie General Store. It was noted but never properly followed up on. Potential evidence was collected, catalogued, and then, in several cases, simply lost. A pellet, likely from a Daisy 880 pellet gun, was found on the floor between the bodies of the two boys. Part of the pellet gun sights, broken off, were found in the living room. This suggested that a pellet gun had been used during the attack, possibly to intimidate or control the victims before the more lethal weapons were employed. Investigators noted these findings but did not pursue them aggressively. The cabin's telephone had been taken off the hook. All of the lights had been turned off. These details pointed to deliberate action by the killers, an effort to prevent the victims from calling for help and to conceal the activity inside the cabin. This was not a frenzied, spontaneous act. This was planned. The killers had thought about what they were doing. They had prepared for it, and when it was done, they had cleaned up enough to leave, taken Tina, and disappeared into the night. And somehow, that feels both meticulously evil and perfectly human. Because the most terrifying thing about the Keddie murders is not the violence itself. It is the ordinariness of the context. A small town, a quiet night, neighbors who knew each other's names, and a crime that happened not in some distant city, not in a dark alley, but in a living room, in a cabin, in a place that was supposed to be safe. Which brings us to the question that everyone in Keddie was asking by Sunday afternoon: who did this? And the answer, frustratingly, was already beginning to take shape. The suspects were not hard to find. They lived across the street. We should talk more carefully about what was found inside cabin 28 on the morning of April 12th. Not for sensationalism, not for shock value, but because the details of the crime scene tell us things about the killers and their intentions that matter for understanding why this case unfolded the way it did. The living room of cabin 28 was a small space, a couch, a chair, perhaps a small table. The room served as the main gathering area for a family of 6. It was not large, and on the morning of April 12th, it was covered in blood. The walls, the floor, the furniture. Blood spatter analysis, even at the rudimentary level available in 1981, indicated that the violence had been intense and sustained. This was not a single blow or a quick stabbing. This was a prolonged assault involving multiple weapons and almost certainly multiple attackers. Sue Sharp was found in the living room. She had been bound with medical tape and electrical cords. She had been beaten with a hammer. She had been stabbed. The combination of blunt force trauma and stabbing wounds indicated that the attackers used whatever weapons were available, or that they had brought multiple weapons specifically for this purpose. The use of bindings suggests that the killers intended to restrain their victims before killing them, which points to premeditation. You do not bring medical tape and electrical cords to a spontaneous attack. John Sharp was found near his mother. He, too, had been bound and beaten. At 15, John was large enough to have put up resistance, and there is evidence that he did. The violence inflicted on John was severe. Whether he was ambushed while sleeping, surprised while watching television, or confronted while trying to protect his mother is not entirely clear from the available evidence, but the injuries he sustained suggest that he fought back and that the attackers responded with overwhelming force. Dana Wingate, 17, was found with Sue and John. He had been bound and beaten as well. Like John, Dana was old enough and large enough to have posed a threat to the attackers, and the level of violence suggests that neutralizing him required significant effort. Dana was not the target. He was not supposed to be there, at least not in the killer's plan. If the theory of premeditation is correct, his presence was an unexpected complication, and he was killed because he was a witness. 2 bloodied knives and a hammer were left at the scene. The knives were not matched to any known owner in the initial investigation. The hammer was consistent with the type that Smart reported missing from his home. A pellet, likely from a Daisy 880 pellet gun, was found on the floor near the victims. Part of the pellet gun's sights, broken off, were found in the living room. This suggests that a pellet gun may have been used during the initial phase of the attack, perhaps to threaten or control the victims before the more lethal weapons were employed. The cabin's telephone had been taken off the hook. The lights had been turned off. These are deliberate actions. The killers did not want anyone in the cabin to call for help. They did not want the lights to reveal what was happening inside. This is planning. This is forethought. This is not a crime of passion committed in a momentary frenzy. This is 2 people, at minimum, entering a cabin with weapons and restraints, disabling the phone, turning off the lights, and systematically killing 3 people, while 3 children slept in the next room and a 4th, Tina, was taken away. The fact that the 3 boys in the bedroom were not harmed has been the subject of much speculation. One theory is that the killers did not know the boys were there, but this seems unlikely in a community as small as Keddie, where everyone knew everyone's business. Another theory is that the killers deliberately chose not to harm the children, perhaps because the target was Sue, and the killers did not want to cross a line. If such a line can be said to exist in the context of a quadruple homicide. Perhaps because Justin Smart, the stepson of the prime suspect, was among the sleeping boys, and Smart did not want to harm his own stepson. Or perhaps because the killers simply did not have time, or because they were interrupted, or because they were satisfied that the boys had not woken up and therefore could not identify them. The bedroom door was closed, the boys were behind it, and the killers, for whatever reason, left them alive. The crime scene tells one more important story. It tells us about the failure of the investigation, because despite the wealth of physical evidence available in that living room, very little of it was properly processed. Blood samples were collected but not thoroughly tested. Fingerprints were lifted but not matched. The knives were recovered but not traced. The pellet and the broken sights were noted but not pursued. Evidence was boxed up and stored, and over the years, some of it was lost. When Gamberg reopened the case in 2013, he found that significant amounts of evidence from the original crime scene were either missing or had been improperly preserved. The chain of custody, which is essential for evidence to be admissible in court, had been broken in multiple places. Items that should have been tested decades ago were still untested. Reports that should have been followed up on were still sitting in their original file folders, unread. It is impossible to know what might have been found if the crime scene had been processed by a competent forensic team with proper resources and genuine interest in solving the case. But the failure to do so has made the task of solving it now, decades later, exponentially more difficult. And this is where the quiet tragedy of the Keddie case becomes most apparent, not in the violence of the crime itself, which was terrible, but in the slow, systematic failure of every institution that was supposed to respond to it: the sheriff's department, The DOJ, the forensic system, the courts, all of them, one after another, either unable or unwilling to do what needed to be done. And the result is a family destroyed, a community shattered, and a case that remains open after more than 40 years. In the hours and days after the discovery in Cabin 28, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office and the DOJ agents began interviewing residents of the Keddie Resort. In a community this small, everyone was a potential witness, and nearly everyone had something to say. Martin Smart was among the first to be interviewed. He told investigators that on the evening of April 11th, he and Bo Bubede had gone to the backdoor bar at the Keddie Lodge for drinks. According to Smart, there had been some issue with loud music earlier that evening, and he was annoyed about it. He said he called the bar to complain, then went there in person with Bubede for more drinks. He described seeing an unfamiliar man enter the bar at some point, someone he characterized as out of place. The man was described as a white male in his early 20s, about 5'7" or 5'8", with long hair tied in a ponytail and a dark mustache, carrying a buck knife on his belt. Smart also described a second man who had entered the bar around 1 in the morning to buy a case of beer. These descriptions of strangers at the bar became the basis for composite sketches. But here is another detail that defies explanation. The sketches were not produced by a trained forensic artist. They were not drawn by the FBI, which had top forensic sketch artists available. They were not drawn by the DOJ, which also had access to professional artists. Instead, the composite sketches were produced by a man named Harlan Embry, a local volunteer with no artistic ability and no training in forensic sketching whatsoever. The resulting sketches were, predictably, of limited value. They looked like they had been drawn by someone who had never taken a drawing class because they had not. Why the sheriff's department, with access to the DOJ and the FBI, chose to use an untrained amateur to produce the most critical visual evidence in a quadruple homicide has never been satisfactorily explained. It is one of many decisions in this investigation that ranges from baffling to suspicious, depending on your charitable inclinations. The Seabold family was also interviewed. Multiple members of the family recalled seeing an unfamiliar green van parked near the Sharp house at around 9 o'clock on the evening of April 11th. The van was never identified. Its driver was never found. It remains one of the loose threads of the case, a detail that might mean everything or nothing. Sheila Sharp, still reeling from the trauma of discovering her family's bodies, was interviewed as well. She told investigators that she had heard no unusual sounds during the night while sleeping at the Seabolds. The walls between cabins 27 and 28 were thin, but Sheila heard nothing. The Seabold family heard nothing. The only people who reported hearing anything were the couple in cabin 16, who described muffled screaming at around 1:15 in the morning. And then there was Justin Smart. Justin, 12 years old, was in the boys' bedroom of cabin 28 when the murders took place. He was sleeping over with Rick and Greg. When interviewed, Justin initially offered limited information. He said he had been asleep. He said he did not hear anything. He said he did not know what had happened. But his story changed. Over the course of multiple interviews, Justin's account shifted. He began to describe a dream. In this dream, he said, he had seen things. He had seen his mother's husband, Martin Smart, in the cabin. He had seen another man. He had seen violence. The details were fragmentary, inconsistent, the kind of images that a traumatized child might produce when asked to make sense of something incomprehensible. Eventually, Justin was placed under hypnosis, a practice that was used with some regularity in criminal investigations in the early 1980s, but that has since been largely discredited as a reliable method of retrieving accurate memories. Under hypnosis, Justin claimed to have seen Sue Sharp with two men. Based on Justin's descriptions, the composite sketches of the two unknown men were produced by Harlan Embry. Now, the question of what Justin Smart actually saw that night has been debated for decades. Did he dream it? Did he witness it? Was he told what to say? Was he protecting someone? Justin was 12 years old, sleeping in a cabin where 4 people were being murdered. His stepfather, Martin Smart, was the prime suspect. The pressure on this child, the impossible position he was in, is almost too painful to contemplate. He was being asked to either implicate or exonerate his own family. He was a child caught between the truth and survival. And whatever the truth was, it was locked inside a 12-year-old boy who had every reason in the world to be afraid. Meanwhile, the investigation was already beginning to fracture. Bo Bobede, Smart's friend and housemate, was not initially considered a person of interest. He was interviewed briefly and then, just 2 days after the murders, he left Keddie entirely. He packed up and left 2 days after 4 people were brutally murdered in the cabin directly across the lane from his, and no one stopped him. Martin Smart was also allowed to leave Plumas County shortly after his initial interviews. He drove to Klamath Falls, Oregon. He later moved to Reno, Nevada. He eventually ended up in the Portland area, then in Paradise, California. At no point was he arrested. At no point was he formally charged. He was the prime suspect in a quadruple homicide, and he was allowed to simply drive away. And now, here is where we need to talk about the hammer. During his initial interviews, Martin Smart mentioned almost casually that a claw hammer had gone missing from his home. He said it had disappeared sometime before the murders. He did not know where it was. A hammer was recovered at the crime scene in cabin 28, along with 2 knives. Investigators later determined that the hammer at the scene was consistent with the type of hammer Smart described as missing from his home. So to be clear about what happened here, a man living across the street from a cabin where 3 people were beaten to death with a hammer tells investigators that a hammer has gone missing from his home. A hammer matching that description is found at the murder scene. And this man is allowed to leave town without being arrested. There were other issues with the investigation in those early days. The DOJ agents Bradley and Krim, along with a fingerprint expert named Spiro Vassos and an evidence expert named Bruce Palmer, processed the scene. But although a significant amount of potential evidence was collected and catalogued, very little worthwhile forensic information was extracted from it. Remember, DNA technology was not available for criminal cases in 1981, so blood typing was the primary tool for connecting biological evidence to suspects. But even blood typing results were not aggressively pursued. Some evidence simply disappeared. Reports were filed and then misfiled. Leads were noted and then not followed. The second bloody knife found in the trash behind the general store was acknowledged, but never properly analyzed. or connected to the case. It was as if the investigation was generating information without any mechanism for processing it. Details went in, but nothing came out. 3 months after the murders, Sheriff Doug Thomas resigned from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. He took a job with the Sacramento Department of Justice, the same department that had sent agents to investigate the Keddie murders, the same department whose organized crime unit, rather than its homicide division, had handled the case. The timing of this career move has been noted by virtually everyone who has examined the case. Whether it represents corruption, coincidence, or simply a sheriff who was in over his head and wanted out is a matter of interpretation. But the optics are not good. The sheriff who failed to solve the biggest murder case in his county's history left his job and went to work for the agency whose handling of the investigation had been, at best, inadequate. Sheila Sharp would later say publicly that she believed the suspects had been told to leave town, that the case had been covered up, that the people responsible for finding justice for her family had instead made sure that justice would never come. And for more than 30 years, she appeared to be right. The Keddie murders are, in many ways, a case study in the limitations of rural law enforcement. And while it is easy to point fingers at specific individuals, the structural problems that contributed to the failure of this investigation deserve examination because they affect communities across the country to this day. Plumas County in 1981 was not a place that experienced violent crime on a regular basis. The sheriff's department was small, under-resourced, and accustomed to dealing with property crimes, domestic disputes, and the occasional barroom fight. A quadruple homicide was not something they were prepared for. The department did not have forensic specialists on staff. It did not have homicide detectives with extensive experience in major cases. It did not have the laboratory facilities to process complex physical evidence. It was a rural department doing its best with what it had, and what it had was not enough. This is not an indictment of every small town sheriff's department in America. Many rural departments do excellent work with limited resources. But the reality is that when a major crime occurs in a jurisdiction that lacks the expertise and equipment to investigate it properly, the case is at risk from the very beginning. The decision to call in the Department of Justice was, in principle, the right one. Sheriff Thomas recognized that his department was overwhelmed and requested outside assistance. But the assistance that arrived was problematic for the reasons we have already discussed. The DOJ sent agents from its organized crime unit rather than its homicide division. The agents who came did not bring the forensic expertise that the case required, and their handling of the investigation, including the decision to allow key suspects to leave the area, has been criticized by virtually everyone who has subsequently examined the case. There is also the matter of institutional culture. In 1981, law enforcement in rural California operated with a degree of informality that would be unthinkable in a major metropolitan department. Officers knew the residents. Relationships were personal, not just professional. And when a suspect in a murder case happened to be a friend of the sheriff or a known entity in the community, the boundaries between investigation and social connection could become blurred. This is not to say that Sheriff Thomas was complicit in the murders. There is no evidence of that. But the suggestion that his relationship with Smart, or at least his knowledge of Smart, may have influenced the handling of the case is not unreasonable. The fact that evidence was lost, that the anonymous tip tape was sealed and forgotten, that the letter from Smart was never entered into evidence, that composite sketches were drawn by an untrained volunteer, all of these individual failures add up to a systemic catastrophe. Each mistake on its own might be forgivable. Taken together, they represent a complete breakdown of the investigative process, and the cost of that breakdown was borne not by the department or by the DOJ or by any of the officials involved. It was borne by the Sharp family, by Sheila and Rick and Greg, who waited for justice that never came, by the Wingates, who lost Dana, by the community of Keddie, which was never the same. Have you ever wondered how many cold cases across the country are the result not of unsolvable crimes, but of solvable crimes that were simply not solved? How many murderers walk free because a fingerprint was lost, a report was misfiled, a witness was not interviewed, a suspect was allowed to leave? The Keddie case is a stark reminder that the difference between justice and injustice often comes down not to the cleverness of the criminal, but to the competence and integrity of the people charged with investigating the crime. It is worth taking a moment to consider what the Keddie investigation could have looked like if it had been conducted properly, not to be cruel or to rub salt in the wound, but because understanding what should have happened throws into sharp relief just how badly things went wrong. In a competent investigation of a quadruple homicide, the first priority would be securing the crime scene. Every person entering cabin 28 would be logged. Every surface would be photographed. Every piece of evidence would be collected, catalogued, and preserved according to established forensic protocols. Bloodstain pattern analysis would be conducted by a trained expert. The hammer, the knives, the pellet gun fragments, the bindings would all be processed for fingerprints, blood type matches, and any other forensic evidence available with 1981 technology. The fingerprint found on the back staircase handrail would be run through every available database. The second bloody knife found in the trash behind the general store would be collected immediately and processed alongside the weapons from the crime scene. The telephone, which had been taken off the hook, would be examined for fingerprints and trace evidence. The light switches would be dusted. The doors would be checked. Every entry and exit point would be documented. Witnesses would be interviewed promptly and thoroughly. The couple in cabin 16 who heard muffled screaming at 1:15 in the morning would be questioned in detail. What did the screaming sound like? How long did it last? Did they hear voices? Did they hear vehicles? Multiple members of the Seabold family who saw the green van would be interviewed separately, and their descriptions would be compared for consistency. The van would be the subject of a region-wide alert. The suspects, Smart and Bubede, would be interrogated by experienced homicide detectives, not interviewed casually and then released. Their homes in cabin 26 would be searched with a warrant for evidence connecting them to the crime, blood-stained clothing, additional weapons, medical tape matching the type used to bind the victims. Their movements on the night of April 11th would be reconstructed in detail, with corroboration sought from independent witnesses. Justin Smart, the 12-year-old boy in the bedroom, would be interviewed by a child psychologist trained in forensic interviewing, not by sheriff's deputies using hypnosis. His statements would be recorded, transcribed, and analyzed by professionals who understood the complexities of child witness testimony. Composite sketches, if needed, would be produced by a trained forensic artist, not by a volunteer with no artistic ability. The sketches would be distributed widely and compared against known associates of the suspects, and critically, the suspects would not be allowed to leave town. In a properly conducted investigation, Smart and Bubede would have been held as persons of interest, if not formally arrested, until the investigation had progressed to the point where they could be either charged or cleared. None of this happened. The crime scene was processed inadequately. Witnesses were not thoroughly interviewed. Suspects were not aggressively questioned. Evidence was not properly handled. Composite sketches were amateurish, and the suspects walked away. The investigation that should have been was, in every meaningful sense, the opposite of the investigation that was, and the cost of that inversion has been measured in decades of silence, in a family's unresolved grief, and in the slow death of a community that might have survived if justice had been served. Let's talk about the men who almost certainly committed these murders, and about the evidence that points to them, and about why, despite all of it, no one has ever been formally charged. Martin Smart, Marty, as people called him, born around 1949 or 1950, which would have put him in his early 30s at the time of the murders, a Vietnam veteran, a man with a documented history of psychological instability, heavy drinking, and volatile behavior. He lived in cabin 26 at the Keddie Resort with his wife Marilyn, her sons from a prior marriage, and his friend, Boba Bede. Cabin 26 sat directly across Spanish Oaks Lane from cabin 28. You could walk from one front door to the other in less than a minute. Smart's marriage to Marilyn was troubled, and the nature of those troubles matters to the story. There is some indication, though the details are not entirely consistent across sources, that Smart harbored resentment toward Sue Sharp. Some investigators and researchers have suggested that the motive for the murders may have been personal, rooted in some grudge or conflict between Smart and Sue. Others have suggested that the motive may have been related to something Sue knew or something Sue had seen. The exact catalyst remains unclear, but the consensus among those who have studied the case most carefully is that the murders were premeditated and that they were specifically targeted at Sue Sharp. The evidence pointing to Smart is substantial. There is the missing hammer, which we have already discussed. There is the fact that he lived within walking distance of the crime scene and had easy access to the cabin, whose doors were routinely left unlocked. There is Justin Smart's shifting and conflicting testimony, which, regardless of its reliability, kept circling back to Martin Smart's involvement. There is the fact that Smart left Plumas County shortly after the murders and never returned to live there. But the single most damning piece of evidence against Martin Smart is a letter. Shortly after the murders, Smart drove to Reno, Nevada, and from there, perhaps to Klamath Falls, Oregon, where he stayed with family or friends while the initial heat of the investigation cooled. During this period, he wrote a letter to his wife Marilyn. The letter was on flowery yellow stationery, the kind of paper that seems painfully incongruous with its contents. In the letter, Smart ruminated on his marriage, on his personal struggles, on his feelings for Marilyn, and in that letter, he wrote a sentence that, 40 years later, still makes the blood run cold. He wrote, and I am paraphrasing here because the exact wording matters, but the meaning is unmistakable, that he had paid the price of Marilyn's love and that he had bought it with 4 people's lives. 4 people's lives. The number of victims in the Keddie murders was 4: Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. Smart's letter references 4 people. When Plumas County Special Investigator Mike Gamberg reviewed the letter decades later, he described it bluntly. "If it is not a confession," he said, "it is damned sure close." And yet, this letter was overlooked in the initial investigation. It was not entered into evidence. It was not used to build a case against Smart. It sat in a file somewhere, gathering dust, while the years ticked by and the case went cold. When Gamberg found it and recognized its significance, he was stunned, not by the letter itself, but by the fact that it had been sitting there for more than 30 years without anyone acting on it. There is also the matter of what Smart allegedly told his counselor. Smart was seeing a therapist or counselor in the period after the murders, which is not surprising given his history of psychological problems. According to the counselor, who later came forward with this information, Smart admitted to the murders of Sue and Tina during their sessions, but he allegedly added a qualifier. He said he did not have anything to do with the boys, meaning John and Dana. The counselor reported that Smart told him Tina was killed because she had witnessed the whole thing and could identify him. Now, counselor-client confidentiality is a serious legal and ethical matter, and the circumstances under which this information came to light are complicated. But the substance of the alleged admission is chilling. Smart admitted to killing Sue, the primary target. He admitted to killing Tina, the witness, and he distanced himself from the murders of John and Dana, suggesting that someone else, presumably Bubede, had killed the 2 boys. Which brings us to Severin John Bubede, Bo Bubede, the man with 2 known aliases, Bobby Lake and John DeSantis. A man in his 50s with known connections to organized crime in Chicago. A man who left Keddie just 2 days after the murders and was never seriously pursued as a suspect by the initial investigation. Bubed's background is murky in the way that the backgrounds of people with mob connections tend to be. He had arrived in Keddie through his association with Martin Smart, and the 2 men were living together in cabin 26. How a man with ties to the Chicago mob ended up in a rundown resort cabin in the Sierra Nevada is not entirely clear, but investigators have speculated that Bobede may have been hiding out, lying low after some trouble elsewhere. Plumas County, with its remoteness and its lack of law enforcement resources, would have been an appealing place for someone who did not want to be found. The theory that has gained the most traction among serious investigators is this. Smart and Bubede entered cabin 28 together on the night of April 11th. They came armed with a hammer, knives, and medical tape. They may have also brought a pellet gun. They came to harm Sue Sharp, and they brought enough weaponry to subdue anyone else who might be in the cabin. John and Dana, who were not the intended targets, were killed because they were there and they could identify their attackers. Tina was taken because she witnessed the murders and could identify the killers. The investigator known by the online alias D. Mac, who has spent years independently researching the Keddie murders and has shared significant information with the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, believes the crimes were premeditated. His reasoning is based on the behavior of the suspects that night and what they allegedly brought to cabin 28. Medical tape, knives, a hammer, and probably a pellet gun. You do not bring those items on a casual late-night visit. And here is where the quiet devastation of this case becomes almost unbearable. Because the evidence was there. It was there from almost the beginning. The suspects lived across the street. They had means, motive, and opportunity. One of them essentially confessed in a letter. The other had organized crime connections that may have shielded him from prosecution. And yet no charges were ever filed. Bubede died in 1988. He would have been in his 50s at the time of the murders. He died without ever being charged. Smart died in 2006. He lived for 25 years after the murders. He moved from state to state. He lived in Oregon, in Nevada, in California. He lived freely, and then he died, without ever being charged. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to know, or to believe with near certainty, that the people who murdered your mother and your siblings are walking around free? Sheila Sharp has lived with that knowledge for more than 40 years. She has carried it through her entire adult life. She was 14 when she found the bodies. She has spent every year since then waiting for a justice that has never come. And somehow, that feels like its own kind of crime. Not the kind that gets investigated, not the kind that makes the evening news, but a slow, quiet failure of every institution that was supposed to protect this family, a failure that compounds with each passing year. Let's talk about Tina. Now let's talk about what may have driven these murders, because while the identity of the likely killers is widely agreed upon by serious investigators, the motive remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. There are several theories, and they are not all mutually exclusive. The first and most commonly discussed theory is personal. Martin Smart had a grudge against Sue Sharp. The nature of this grudge has been characterized differently by different sources. Some have suggested that there was a romantic or sexual element, that Smart had made advances towards Sue that were rejected, or that Smart believed Sue was interfering in his marriage to Marilyn. Others have suggested that the conflict was more practical, related to disputes between neighbors or to something Sue knew about Smart's activities. There is also the possibility that the motive was connected to drugs. Rural Northern California in the early 1980s was not immune to the drug culture that was spreading across the country. Marijuana cultivation was common in the remote mountain areas of Plumas and Butte counties. Methamphetamine was beginning to appear, and a man like Bubede, with his organized crime connections, might well have been involved in activities that he did not want exposed. If Sue Sharp knew something, or saw something, or was perceived as a threat to whatever illegal enterprise was operating in or around the Keddie Resort, that could have been sufficient motivation for the killings. The letter Smart wrote to Marilyn, in which he referenced paying for her love with 4 people's lives, suggests that the motive was deeply personal to Smart. It reads as the statement of a man who committed murder for emotional reasons, not financial ones. He was trying to prove something to his wife. He was trying to buy her love through violence. The twisted logic of that statement, the idea that killing 4 people could somehow demonstrate devotion, speaks to a profoundly disturbed mind. But even if Smart's motive was personal, Bubede's involvement introduces additional complications. Why would Bubede, a man with organized crime ties and no apparent personal connection to Sue Sharp, participate in the murders? The most likely explanation is that Bubede was helping his friend. Smart and Bubede were close enough to share a cabin, and men in Bubede's world were accustomed to solving problems through violence. Smart may have asked for Bubedi's help, and Bubedi may have agreed, either out of loyalty, because he was paid, or because he had his own reasons for wanting the residents of cabin 28 silenced. There is also the question of whether other people were involved. The green van seen near cabin 28 at around 9 o'clock on the evening of April 11th was never identified. If it belonged to one of the suspects or to an accomplice, it suggests that the operation involved more than just Smart and Bubedi. Sheriff Hagwood's statement that other living individuals have been identified as persons of interest further supports the possibility that the conspiracy extended beyond the two primary suspects. The theory that has gained the most traction among researchers and investigators looks something like this. Smart decided to kill Sue Sharp for personal reasons that may have involved jealousy, resentment, or a desire to prove something to his wife. He recruited Bubed to help. They prepared by gathering weapons and restraints. They waited for a night when they knew the layout of cabin 28, when they knew who was there and who was not. They may have monitored the cabin during the evening, perhaps even visited the bar at the lodge to establish an alibi, and sometime after midnight, they crossed the narrow lane from cabin 26 to cabin 28, entered through the unlocked doors, and carried out the murders. John and Dana were not the intended targets, but they were present and they were old enough to fight back and to identify the attackers. So they were killed. Tina witnessed the violence, so she was taken, removed from the cabin to prevent her from identifying the killers and subsequently murdered. Her body was transported to a remote location in Butte County and left there. The three young boys in the bedroom either slept through the entire event or were too frightened to open the door. Justin Smart, whether he witnessed anything or not, was the stepson of one of the killers, which may have afforded him a degree of protection. The other two boys, Rick and Greg, were young enough that the killers may have believed they would not be able to identify them even if they had woken up. After the murders, Smart and Bubede returned to cabin 26. They disposed of some of the weapons, dropping the hammer into a nearby pond. They went about their business the next day. When questioned, they provided alibis and descriptions of strangers at the bar. And then, within days, they left Keddie. Bubed left within 48 hours. Smart followed shortly after, and they were never arrested. This theory is not proven. No one has ever stood trial for the Keddie murders, but it is the theory that best fits the available evidence, and it is the theory that investigators like Gamberg have been working from as they continue to pursue the case. The question that remains is not really who did it. The question is whether it will ever be officially resolved. To understand Martin Smart's behavior in the weeks and months surrounding the murders, you need to understand his marriage. Because the marriage between Martin and Marilyn Smart was, by all accounts, a volatile and troubled union. And the letter he wrote to Marilyn after the murders suggests that the killings were, in his distorted mind, an act of devotion. Martin and Marilyn had been married for several years by 1981. Marilyn had children from a prior relationship, including Justin, who was 12 at the time of the murders. Martin was a Vietnam veteran with significant psychological issues. He drank heavily. He had a temper. His moods were unpredictable. The marriage was marked by arguments, by tension, by the kind of low-grade domestic turmoil that is exhausting to live through and difficult to escape. Marilyn and Martin were both enrolled in the typing class at Feather River College. the same class that Sue Sharp attended. This meant that all three of them interacted regularly in a social setting. Whether this interaction was benign or whether it created friction between Martin and Sue is not definitively established, but the proximity of these three adults living within yards of each other and attending the same class suggests ample opportunity for conflict. Some researchers have speculated that Martin may have been jealous of Sue for reasons that are not entirely clear. Perhaps he perceived her as a rival for Marilyn's attention or friendship. Perhaps he resented something about her presence in the community. Perhaps there was a specific incident, a comment, a confrontation that triggered his rage. Whatever the catalyst, the letter he wrote to Marilyn from Reno, with its reference to buying her love with 4 people's lives, makes it clear that the murders were, in his mind, connected to his feelings for his wife. Marilyn's role in the case is complicated. She was Martin's wife. She was Justin's mother. She lived in cabin 26, steps away from where the murders occurred. She was presumably asleep, or at least in her cabin, on the night of April 11th. Whether she knew in advance what Martin planned to do is not established. Whether she knew afterward, before the bodies were discovered, is also not established. But she remained married to Martin for some time after the murders, even after the family left Keddie. In 2008, Marilyn publicly stated in a documentary that she believed Martin and Bubedi were responsible for the murders. This statement, made decades after the fact and long after Martin's death in 2006, was significant because it came from the person closest to the primary suspect. Marilyn had lived with Martin. She had known him intimately. She had read the letter, or at least known of its existence, and she had come to the conclusion that her husband was a murderer. The dynamics of this situation are painful to contemplate. Marilyn was a woman married to a man she eventually came to believe was a killer. Her son Justin had been in the cabin during the murders. Her stepson and his friend had lived across the street from the people her husband allegedly killed. She was enmeshed in the crime not as a perpetrator, but as a bystander, a person who was close enough to the truth to see its outlines, but perhaps too afraid, too loyal, or too trapped to speak until decades had passed and her husband was safely dead. To be fair to Marilyn, speaking out against a violent spouse is one of the most dangerous things a person can do. If she suspected Martin of murder and she was still married to him, her silence may have been less a choice than a survival strategy. We should be careful about judging her for not coming forward sooner when the potential consequences of doing so could have been lethal. But the fact remains that Marilyn's eventual statement, combined with the letter, the counselor's testimony, the physical evidence, and the DNA match to a living person of interest, forms a body of evidence that, in a more functional legal system, might have led to charges. The case against Smart and Bobede, while circumstantial, is substantial. What has been lacking is not evidence but institutional will. Severin John Bobede deserves more attention than he has traditionally received in discussions of the Keddie murders. While Martin Smart is usually presented as the primary suspect, the driver of the violence, the man with the motive, Bubed was no passive participant. He was a man with a particular set of skills, a particular set of connections, and a particular willingness to use violence that set him apart from the average resident of a mountain town in Plumas County. Bubede was born around the late 1920s or early 1930s, placing him in his 50s At the time of the murders, he used at least 2 known aliases, Bobby Lake and John DeSantis, which immediately tells you something about his lifestyle. People who use multiple identities are usually running from something or hiding something. In Bubedi's case, what he was hiding, or at least what he was connected to, was organized crime in Chicago. The specifics of Bubedi's organized crime connections are not fully documented in the public record. What is known is that law enforcement was aware of these connections and that they were significant enough to raise questions about how the investigation was handled. When the DOJ sent agents from its organized crime unit rather than its homicide division to investigate the Keddie murders, the decision made sense only if the DOJ had a pre-existing interest in Bubedi. If they were already tracking him, already watching him, already building a case against him for other activities, they might have sent organized crime agents not to investigate the murder, but to manage the situation, to protect their informant, to keep their broader investigation from being compromised. This is speculation, and it should be clearly labeled as such. There is no smoking gun proving that the DOJ deliberately sabotaged the murder investigation to protect Bubedi. But the theory has been endorsed by Gamberg and others who have examined the case closely, and the circumstantial evidence is troubling. The DOJ agents who came to Keddie did not conduct an aggressive investigation. They did not press the suspects. They did not follow up on leads that pointed to Smart and Bubedi. And they allowed both men to leave the area without impediment. After leaving Keddie, Bubedi returned to the Chicago area. He died in 1988, at some point in his 50s or early 60s. He was never charged with any crime related to the Keddie murders. He was never formally identified as a suspect by the Plumas County Sheriff's Office during his lifetime. He lived out his remaining years, however many they were, without ever being held accountable for what happened in cabin 28. And this is where the organized crime angle becomes most frustrating. Because if Bubedi was indeed connected to the mob, and if the DOJ was indeed protecting him, then the murder of 4 people in a mountain cabin was, in effect, written off as collateral damage in a larger law enforcement strategy. The lives of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp were weighed against whatever intelligence or investigation the DOJ was pursuing, and they were found to be less important. That is a devastating conclusion, and it may not be accurate, but it is the conclusion that the available evidence suggests, and it is the conclusion that has haunted the surviving Sharp family for more than 4 decades. Now imagine being Sheila Sharp, knowing this, or at least suspecting, that the agency that was supposed to help solve your family's murder may have actually helped the killers escape, that the institutional machinery of justice was not just incompetent, but possibly complicit, that the failure was not accidental, but strategic. I do not know how you carry that. I do not know how you wake up each morning and put one foot in front of the other, knowing that the system designed to protect your family may have deliberately looked the other way. But Sheila has carried it for more than 40 years, and she is still here, and she is still fighting for answers. Tina Louise Sharp was born on July 22nd, 1968. She was 12 years old on the night she disappeared from cabin 28. 12. A child. A girl who liked the things that girls like at 12. Who had friends and routines and a life that was still in its earliest chapters. She had moved to Keddie with her mother and her siblings less than a year before. She shared a bedroom with her mother. She was part of the fabric of this small community, playing with the other children, walking the dirt roads, living the quiet, unremarkable life of a kid in a mountain town. And on the night of April 11th, 1981, she was taken. When investigators processed the crime scene in cabin 28 the following morning, Tina was not among the dead. She was not in the cabin at all. Her absence turned the case from a triple homicide into something even more terrifying. A triple homicide and a kidnapping. Because while the bodies of Sue, John, and Dana told a horrible but complete story, Tina's absence told a story with no ending. Where was she? Was she alive? Had she been taken for a reason? Was there a chance, however slim, that she might be found? The initial search for Tina focused on the area around Keddie. Plumas County is vast and rugged, covered in dense forest and crossed by rivers and streams. The terrain is steep and difficult. Search teams combed through the woods around the resort, looking for any sign of the missing girl. They found nothing, no clothing, no footprints, no blood trail, nothing. The absence of a trail suggested that Tina had been carried. A 12-year-old girl being forced to walk through mountain forest at night would have left some trace, broken branches, scuff marks in the dirt, something. But there was nothing. This pointed to the probability that Tina was either incapacitated or already dead when she was removed from the cabin, and that she was transported by vehicle rather than on foot. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Tina Sharp was listed as a missing person. Her photograph was distributed. Articles were published in the Feather River Bulletin, the local newspaper. But the leads dried up and the case stalled, and Tina's disappearance became one more unanswered question in a case full of them. And then, on April 22nd, 1984, a little more than 3 years after the murders, a man who was collecting bottles and recyclables in the woods in rural Butte County made a discovery. He was in a remote area near Camp 18, close to Feather Falls, about 62 miles from Keddie. In the brush and dirt, he found human remains, a skull, a jawbone, several other bones. The Butte County Sheriff's Department was called. Almost immediately, an anonymous phone call came into the department. The caller was male. He said he had been watching the news about the discovery at Feather Falls, and he wanted to know if investigators had considered a connection to the murder up in Keddie a couple of years earlier, where a 12-year-old girl had never been found. The anonymous caller knew about the Keddie murders. He knew about Tina. He knew that her body had never been recovered. And he was calling from somewhere in the region, suggesting a proximity to the case that was more than casual. The remains were examined and eventually confirmed to belong to Tina Sharp. The confirmation came through dental records and other identifying features. The cause of her death could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition, as more than 3 years had passed since the murders. But it is widely believed, and investigators have generally agreed, that Tina was murdered, likely on the night of April 11th or shortly thereafter, and that her body was transported to the remote location where it was found. 62 miles. That is the distance from Keddie to Camp 18 near Feather Falls. It is a long way to carry a body. It is a long way to drive in the middle of the night on mountain roads. Whoever took Tina from cabin 28 and deposited her remains in that remote stretch of Butte County forest was deliberate methodical, and familiar with the area. This was not a random dumping. This was someone who knew the terrain, knew the back roads, and knew where to go to avoid being seen. Investigators later noted that Martin Smart allegedly lived in Paradise, California, at the time of the anonymous phone call. Paradise is in Butte County. Other persons of interest in the case also had connections to Butte County. The geography is suggestive, if not conclusive. The anonymous phone call was recorded. The tape was sealed and placed in the case files, and then, remarkably, it sat there, untouched, unexamined, for nearly 30 years. When the case was reopened in 2013, investigators found the sealed tape in the files, still in its original packaging. No one had listened to it since it was recorded in 1984. Let that settle in for a moment. An anonymous caller provided a direct tip connecting the Keddie murders to the discovery of Tina's remains. The call was recorded, and then the tape was filed away and forgotten. For 3 decades, while the case went cold, while the suspects lived their lives, while the surviving children grew up without their mother, without their brother, without their sister, the discovery of Tina's remains in 1984 should have reinvigorated the investigation. It should have prompted a renewed focus on the prime suspects, both of whom were still alive at the time. Bubedi would not die until 1988. Smart would not die until 2006. There were years, decades, in which charges could have been filed, in which a case could have been built, in which justice could have been pursued, but it was not. The investigation continued in a desultory fashion through the 1980s and into the 90s, but no charges were ever brought. Other suspects were briefly considered. In 1996, Robert Joseph Silveria Jr., known as the Boxcar Killer, a serial killer who rode freight trains across the country and confessed to murdering roughly 28 people, was briefly looked at as a possible suspect. But Silveria operated alone, and the Keddie murders were clearly committed by at least 2 people. He was ruled out. The case went cold. The files gathered dust. The surviving Sharp children grew up in the shadow of something that should never have touched them. And in Keddie itself, the town began to die. The murders had shattered the already fragile sense of safety in the community. Tourists stopped coming. Not that many had been coming to begin with. Families moved away. The cabins fell further into disrepair. By the early 1990s, the water supply at the resort was found to be contaminated. Cabins were condemned. The bar closed. The restaurant closed. The general store closed. Keddie, which had never been much more than a cluster of cabins and a post office, became a ghost town in all but name. Cabin 28 stood empty for years after the murders. No one wanted to rent it. No one wanted to be inside it. There were stories, the kind that small communities generate around places of violence. People said they heard moans coming from the cabin. They said they saw shadows in the windows. The owner of the resort, Gary Molleth, tried to renovate and sell the property, but the history of the place made it impossible. Squatters moved into some of the empty cabins. The property decayed. In 2004, Cabin 28 was demolished. It was torn down along with several other condemned buildings on the grounds. The physical structure where 4 people were murdered was reduced to rubble and hauled away. The land remains. If you drive along State Route 70 between Quincy and the highway, you can still see the old resort building, boarded up and weathered. standing by the side of the road like a marker for something no one wants to remember, but no one can forget. And this is where it gets quietly devastating, because tearing down Cabin 28 did not erase what happened there. It did not bring Sue back. It did not bring John or Dana or Tina back. It did not give Sheila or Rick or Greg closure. It did not answer the questions that have lingered for decades. It just removed the physical evidence, the walls and floors and door frames that might, in some alternate universe where the investigation had been competent, have yielded the answers the family deserved. The destruction of the cabin has led some observers to speculate about a cover-up, whether the demolition was deliberately timed to eliminate evidence, or whether it was simply the practical result of a condemned building reaching the end of its usable life. Depends on whom you ask. But the timing and the context make it hard not to wonder. Picture this. You are driving along Route 70 in Plumas County. The road curves through the canyon, following the river. The trees are dense on both sides. You pass through Keddie without realizing it, because there is almost nothing left. A few standing structures, a road sign, the ghost of a resort that once welcomed visitors and now stands as a monument to neglect and tragedy. Somewhere nearby, in the dirt where Cabin 28 once stood, the ground holds the memory of something terrible. And somewhere out there, a family is still waiting for justice. We talked about Tina's disappearance earlier, but the 3 years between her vanishing and the discovery of her remains deserve closer attention, because those 3 years were a particular kind of hell for the surviving Sharp children and for anyone who cared about this case. When Tina was first reported missing on the morning of April 12, 1981, the assumption was that she had been kidnapped. The scene inside Cabin 28, with 3 dead bodies and no sign of Tina, made abduction the most logical conclusion. But abduction implied something else. It implied that Tina might still be alive, and that possibility, however unlikely given the circumstances, kept hope alive in a way that was both comforting and excruciating. Search parties went out into the mountains around Keddie. Volunteers joined law enforcement in combing through the dense forests and steep terrain. They looked along the riverbanks. They checked abandoned buildings and mine shafts. They walked the railroad tracks and the fire roads. Tina's photograph was distributed. Articles appeared in the Feather River Bulletin, the local newspaper. The community, stunned by the murders, channeled its shock into the search for the missing girl. But the Sierra Nevada in the spring is a vast and unforgiving landscape. The forests are thick with undergrowth. The terrain is crossed by ravines and gullies that can swallow a person and leave no trace. If Tina had been carried into those woods, alive or dead, finding her would require extraordinary luck. The search produced nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no signs of a camp or a hiding place, nothing. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the hope that Tina might be found alive began to fade. It did not disappear entirely, because hope is stubborn and grief does not follow a schedule. But it dimmed, quietly and steadily, like a light behind a closing door. For Sheila, who was 14 and already carrying the weight of discovering her family's bodies, Tina's disappearance added another dimension of torment. Her sister was out there somewhere, alive or dead, and no one could find her. Every day that passed without news was a day of not knowing, and not knowing is its own form of suffering, worse perhaps than certainty. because with certainty you can begin to grieve. Without it, you are trapped in a state of perpetual anticipation, waiting for a resolution that may never come. The search for Tina continued sporadically over the following years. Tips came in from time to time. People reported seeing girls who matched Tina's description in various locations. None of the tips panned out. Tina remained a missing person, her name added to databases and flyers and the growing list of children who had vanished without a trace. And then came April 22nd, 1984. The man who found the remains was collecting bottles in the woods near Camp 18, a remote area in Butte County near Feather Falls. He was not looking for anything in particular. He was just going about his day, and there, in the brush and dirt of a rural hillside, he found bones, a skull, a jawbone, other fragments. The Butte County Sheriff's Department responded. The scene was processed, and shortly afterward, the anonymous phone call came in. The male caller, whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, asked whether investigators had considered a connection to the Keddie murders. The identification process took time. Dental records were compared. Anthropological analysis was conducted on the remaining bone fragments, and eventually, the confirmation came. The remains belonged to Tina Louise Sharp. She was 12 years old when she died. She had been dead, in all likelihood, since the night of April 11th, 1981, or very shortly thereafter. The cause of death could not be definitively determined. 3 years of exposure to the elements, to animals, to the natural processes of decomposition had destroyed any soft tissue evidence that might have revealed how Tina was killed. But the manner of her death was, for all practical purposes, not in question. She was murdered. She was murdered by the same people who murdered her mother, her brother, and Dana Wingate. She was murdered because she was a witness. The location of Tina's remains raises its own set of questions. Camp 18 is roughly 62 miles from Keddie, depending on the route. It is not on any direct or obvious path from Keddie to anywhere in particular. To reach it, you would need to travel south on Route 70, then take a series of smaller roads into the rural backcountry of Butte County. It is the kind of place that you would only go to if you knew it existed, if you were familiar with the area, if you had been there before. This suggests that whoever transported Tina's body to Camp 18 had local knowledge of Butte County. They knew the back roads. They knew the remote areas where a body could be deposited with little chance of discovery. And the fact that Tina was not found for 3 years suggests that they chose the location well. The connection to Martin Smart's known later residence in Paradise, California, which is in Butte County, has been noted by investigators. The connection to other persons of interest who also had ties to Butte County has also been noted. The geography of the case, the distance from Keddie to the dump site, the route that would have been required, the knowledge of the terrain that it implies, all of these details point back to the suspects who were known to the investigation from the very beginning. And the anonymous phone call. That call has always seemed like more than a casual tip. The caller knew about the Keddie murders. He knew about Tina's disappearance. He knew that her body had never been found. And he called just days after remains were discovered 62 miles away, suggesting a connection that was not publicly known at the time. This was not a random concerned citizen. This was someone with knowledge of the crime, calling to point investigators in the right direction. Whether the caller was one of the suspects, an accomplice, or someone who had been told about the crime by one of the perpetrators is unknown. Gamberg has been working to analyze the voice on the tape and compare it to recordings of known suspects and persons of interest. But the tape sat sealed in the case files for nearly 30 years before anyone even listened to it. 30 years. 3 decades in which that voice, that critical piece of evidence, gathered dust in a storage room while a family waited for answers. In true crime stories, victims are often reduced to their final moments. They become the person who was found, the body on the floor, the name on the case file. But Sue Sharp was a person long before she was a victim, and she deserves to be remembered as more than the woman who was murdered in cabin 28. The years between 1984 and 2013 are the quiet years of the Keddie case. The years when the files sat in boxes, when the evidence gathered dust, when the surviving Sharp children grew up and tried, in whatever ways they could, to build lives out of the wreckage. Sheila Sharp was 14 when she discovered the bodies. She was the oldest surviving child, and in the aftermath of the murders, with her mother dead, her older brother dead, her younger sister missing, and later confirmed dead, Sheila became something she was never supposed to be. She became a mother. In an interview years later, Sheila described what happened in the simplest and most heartbreaking terms. She said she sheltered her brothers, Rick and Greg. She became their mother, and she found it hard, even decades later, to step back and be a sister, because that is what she was, a sister, not a mother. But the murders had taken that distinction away from her, and the role she assumed at 14 became the role she carried for the rest of her life. Imagine being Sheila Sharp at 15, at 16, at 18. You have seen things that no person should ever see. You have lost your mother, your brother, your sister. You are raising 2 younger boys in a world that has already proven itself to be violent and unjust. You know, or you believe you know, who killed your family, and nothing is being done about it. The suspects are free. The investigation is stalled. No one is coming to help. Rick Sharp, who was 10 at the time of the murders, grew up in the shadow of that night. He was in the bedroom next to the living room, where his mother and brother were killed. He was removed from the cabin through a window the next morning by Jamie Seabolt. He was physically unharmed, but the psychological harm of sleeping through the murder of your family, of being that close to violence and not knowing it was happening, is the kind of wound that does not heal in any conventional sense. It stays with you. It shapes you. It becomes part of the architecture of your life. Greg Sharp was 5 years old on the night of the murders. 5. He likely had no conscious understanding of what had happened. He was too young to process it in the moment. But he grew up knowing. He grew up being told. He grew up being the youngest child of a murdered woman, raised by a teenage sister in a world that had failed his family at every turn. The 3 surviving Sharp children were eventually taken in by family members, though the specifics of their arrangements are not widely documented. What is known is that they endured. They survived. They built lives that were marked by the tragedy, but not entirely defined by it, though it would be dishonest to suggest that any of them escaped its shadow. Meanwhile, in the wider world, the Keddie case faded from public consciousness. It was a rural crime in a remote part of California. It did not have the profile of a high society murder or a serial killer case. It was not covered extensively by national media. It was, In the language of true crime, a cold case, the kind that gets mentioned in local newspaper retrospectives on anniversaries and then gets filed away again until the next anniversary. Within the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, the case was not entirely forgotten, but it was not actively worked either. Officers who had been involved in the original investigation retired or moved on. Institutional knowledge faded. Files were stored, sometimes improperly. Evidence that had been collected in 1981 was maintained, but without the kind of cataloging and preservation that would make it useful for future analysis. The one investigator who might have changed the trajectory of the case, a veteran Plumas County detective named Mike Gamberg, was actually prevented from working it. Gamberg had been handling homicide cases for the county from 1974 until his retirement in 1994. In that 20-year span, he worked every homicide case in Plumas County except one, the Keddie murders. He was not assigned to the case, and he has said publicly that he was not allowed to cover it. The reasons for his exclusion have not been fully explained, but the implication is troubling. The most experienced homicide investigator in the county was kept away from the most significant homicide in the county's history. During the cold case years, the investigation was not entirely dormant. Periodically, tips would come in, names would be suggested, theories would be floated, but nothing came of any of it. The two prime suspects, Smart and Bubede, were never charged. Other potential suspects were examined and dismissed. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved. In 2008, something notable happened. Marilyn Smart, Martin Smart's ex-wife, appeared in a documentary about the murders. In that documentary, she stated publicly that she suspected her former husband Martin and his friend Bo Burbed were responsible for the murders of Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. This was not a courtroom confession, was not sworn testimony, but it was the wife of the primary suspect saying on camera that she believed he did it. Marilyn's statement added another layer to an already deeply layered case. She had been there, in cabin 26, on the night of the murders. She had lived with Smart. She had raised Justin, the boy who was sleeping in cabin 28 when the murders occurred. She knew things, and what she knew or believed pointed directly back to the man she had married. And still, nothing happened. No charges, no arrests, no trial. The cold case years were not just a failure of investigation. They were a failure of will. The evidence existed, the suspects were known, the letter was in the file, the counselor's testimony was available. The anonymous tip was on tape. And yet, the machinery of justice simply did not engage. Whether this was due to incompetence, corruption, institutional inertia, or some combination of all three depends on your reading of the case, but the result was the same. 4 people were dead, 3 children were orphaned, and no one was held responsible. And this is where it gets interesting, because in 2013, something changed. We have talked about the Sharp family's suffering, and rightly so. But the Keddie murders did not only destroy one family, they destroyed a community, and the ripples of that destruction have spread outward through the decades in ways that are less dramatic, but no less real. In the days after the murders, fear descended on Keddie like fog settling into a valley. This was a community where people did not lock their doors, where children played unsupervised in the woods, where neighbors trusted each other because there was no one else to trust. And in a single night, all of that trust evaporated. Suddenly, Everyone was a suspect. The man who lived 2 cabins down, the woman who worked at the general store, the teenagers who hung out at the lodge. In a town of 60 to 100 people, the probability that the killer was someone you knew was not just high. It was nearly certain. And knowing that the person who had bound and beaten and stabbed your neighbors might be the same person you said hello to at the post office was a particular kind of terror that is difficult to appreciate if you have not lived in a very small community. People started locking their doors. That in itself was a statement. In a place where unlocked doors had been a point of communal pride, a signal of trust and safety, the click of a deadbolt was an admission that things had fundamentally changed. The old world was gone. The new world was one where violence could come from anywhere, from anyone, at any time. Families began to leave, not all at once but steadily over the months and years following the murders. The resort, already in decline, accelerated its slide toward abandonment. Cabins emptied. The lodge bar saw fewer and fewer customers. The general store reduced its hours. The post office served fewer addresses. By the early 1990s, the water supply at the resort was found to be contaminated, which led to the condemnation of several cabins. Whether the contamination was related to the murders or was simply another symptom of the property's general deterioration is unclear, but the timing felt symbolic. The place was rotting from the inside out. Tourism, which had been the resort's original purpose, never recovered. Whatever residual appeal Keddie might have had as a mountain getaway was permanently tainted by its association with murder. The people who did come to Keddie after the murders were not vacationers. They were true crime enthusiasts, gawkers, people drawn by morbid curiosity rather than fresh air and trout fishing. The resort had become a landmark of violence rather than a destination for recreation. The officers who worked the case were affected too. Rod DeCrona, the patrol commander for the Plumas County Sheriff's Department, has spoken about the lasting impact of the murders on law enforcement in the area. He described still feeling a chill when patrolling near the old resort. The case was a weight that the department carried, a reminder of its greatest failure, a wound that would not close. Mike Gamberg, the investigator who was excluded from the case for 2 decades before finally being brought in to reopen it, has described the Keddie murders as the case that would not let him go. Even during his years of official exclusion, he thought about it, he read about it, he wondered about it, and when he was finally given the opportunity to investigate it, he threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone who has been waiting a very long time. Life changed dramatically in 1981 for this whole community. Not just Keddie, which is 6 miles west of Quincy, but the broader area. Everybody was suspicious of everybody and afraid of everybody else. Those are Gamberg's words, spoken decades later, and they capture something essential about what the murders did to the social fabric of the region. And this is where it gets quietly devastating, because the trauma of the Keddie murders was not a single event. It was an ongoing process, a wound that was opened on the night of April 11th, 1981, and that has never been allowed to close. Every anniversary, every news report, every podcast episode, every documentary, every time someone drives through Keddie on Route 70 and glances at the old resort building and wonders what happened there. The wound reopens, the community remembers, and the absence of justice keeps the pain alive. One of the more remarkable aspects of the Keddie case is the role played by private citizens and independent researchers in keeping the investigation alive during the decades when official law enforcement had essentially abandoned it. The most notable of these citizen investigators is an individual known by the online alias Darmak, who has spent years meticulously researching the Keddie murders and who operates the Keddie 28 website. Darmak has declined to reveal his real identity, but his work has been acknowledged and in some cases relied upon by official investigators. Mike Gamberg, the Plumas County special investigator who reopened the case, has publicly stated that he respects DMAC's work, even though they do not agree on every detail of the case. DMAC's research has produced significant findings. He has identified the items that the suspects allegedly brought to Cabin 28 on the night of the murders: medical tape, knives, a hammer, and probably a Daisy 880 pellet gun. His analysis of the crime scene and the suspect's behavior has led him to conclude that the murders were premeditated. He has tracked the movements of the suspects after they left Keddie. He has identified connections and relationships that the original investigators either missed or chose not to pursue. The phenomenon of citizen investigation in true crime cases is not unique to Keddie. In the age of the internet, amateur sleuths and dedicated researchers have contributed to the resolution of numerous cold cases across the country. Sometimes their work is valued by law enforcement. Sometimes it is resented. Sometimes it complicates an investigation. Sometimes it cracks it open. In the Keddie case, the citizen investigators filled a vacuum left by official inaction. For decades, while the case files gathered dust in the sheriff's office, private researchers were reading reports, analyzing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building timelines. They kept the case in the public consciousness. They maintained pressure on law enforcement to reopen the investigation. They refused to let the world forget what happened in Cabin 28. This is a double-edged sword. Citizen investigators do not have subpoena power. They cannot compel testimony. They cannot execute search warrants. They cannot arrest suspects, and their work, however diligent, exists outside the formal legal system, which means it cannot, by itself, lead to prosecution. But in a case where the formal legal system has so thoroughly failed, the contributions of citizen investigators have been invaluable. The Keddie case has also been the subject of podcasts, documentaries, and books. In 2016, an episode of People magazine Investigates on the Investigation Discovery Network covered the case, featuring interviews with Sheila Sharp and other key figures. The episode brought renewed public attention to the murders and put additional pressure on the Plumas County Sheriff's Office to pursue the investigation. A horror movie loosely based on the case, also titled Cabin 28, was released, bringing the story to an even wider audience, though in a fictionalized form that bore only a passing resemblance to the actual events. Each time the case receives media attention, the same pattern repeats. Interest spikes, tips come in, investigators review the leads, and then gradually the spotlight moves onto the next case, the next mystery, the next tragedy, and the Keddie murders settle back into the quiet persistence of an unsolved crime, waiting for the day when something, finally, breaks loose. In 2013, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood made a decision that was long overdue. He reopened the Keddie murders case, and he brought in the one person who should have been working it all along. Mike Gamberg, the veteran homicide investigator who had been kept off the case for decades, was appointed as special investigator. Gamberg, who had retired from the sheriff's office in 1994, came back to work. He had spent 20 years investigating homicides in Plumas County. He had handled every case except this one. And now, finally, he was getting his chance. But it was 2013. The murders had occurred 32 years earlier. Both primary suspects were dead. Bubed had died in 1988. Smart had died in 2006. The cabin had been demolished in 2004. Witnesses had moved away, grown old, or died. Memories had faded. Evidence had degraded. The odds of solving a cold case under these circumstances were not good. But Gamberg was methodical, and he was tenacious, and he had something that the original investigators either lacked or chose not to use. He had patience. He went back to the beginning. He pulled the old files. He read every report. He examined every piece of evidence that had been preserved, and he began to find things that should have been found decades earlier. The letter. Smart's letter to Marilyn, written on yellow stationery shortly after the murders, containing the line about paying the price of her love with 4 people's lives. Gamberg found it in the files. It had been there the entire time, overlooked, ignored, set aside by the original investigators as if it were a grocery list rather than what it clearly was, a near confession from the prime suspect in a quadruple homicide. The anonymous tip tape. The recording of the male caller who contacted the Butte County Sheriff's Department in 1984 after Tina's remains were found, asking whether investigators had considered a connection to the Keddie murders. The tape had been sealed in the case files. No one had listened to it since it was recorded. Gamberg found it, unsealed it, and began the process of having the voice analyzed and compared to known recordings of suspects and persons of interest. And then there were the new developments. On March 24th, 2016, a hammer was discovered in a pond near the Keddie Resort. The pond had dried up, and a local man who happened to be in the area noticed the tool lying in the exposed mud bed. He left it there and contacted authorities. Gamberg recovered the hammer. It matched the description of the claw hammer that Martin Smart had claimed went missing from his home before the murders. It matched the type of hammer found at the crime scene. Sheriff Hagwood commented on the find publicly. He said the location where the hammer was found indicated that it had been intentionally placed there. It would not have been accidentally misplaced. Someone had put that hammer in the pond. And the pond was close to the resort, close to the cabins, close to where the suspects had lived. Along with the hammer, a hunting knife was also recovered in the Keddie area. The condition of both tools, decades of rust and exposure to the elements, made forensic analysis challenging. Gamberg expressed hope that once the rust was carefully removed, some form of evidence might be recoverable. But the process of extracting usable forensic information from tools that have been submerged in water and exposed to the elements for 35 years is painstaking and uncertain. And there was DNA. This is perhaps the most significant development in the reopened investigation. Gamberg and his team obtained new DNA evidence. The specifics of where the DNA was found and whose profile it matched have not been fully disclosed publicly, but Gamberg confirmed that there is a DNA match to a living person of interest. He and the sheriff know who the individual is and where to find them. What they have not disclosed is whether they plan to question that person again, or whether an arrest is being considered. The identity of this living person of interest has not been publicly named, but the fact that DNA evidence connects a living individual to the Keddie murders is significant. It means that even with both primary suspects dead, there may be at least one person who was involved in or had direct knowledge of the crime who is still alive. And if that person can be compelled to talk, or if the DNA evidence can be used to build a case, there's still a possibility, however faint, that some form of justice could be served. Gamberg has also identified other living individuals who he believes have information about the crime. In a 2019 interview, Sheriff Hagwood stated that while two of the lead suspects, Smart and Bubede, are now dead, others are alive and have been identified. The implication is that there were people beyond Smart and Bubede who were involved in or had knowledge of the murders and the cover-up. And this is where the case stands today, officially unsolved, actively investigated, with new evidence, new leads, and new DNA connections to living persons of interest, but still without charges, still without an arrest, still without a trial. The frustration of the surviving family members is immense and entirely justified. Sheila Sharp has spent her entire adult life waiting for this case to be resolved. She has spoken publicly about her belief that the investigation was compromised from the start. She has expressed her conviction that the suspects were told to leave town. She has described the deep, enduring pain of knowing who killed her family and being unable to do anything about it. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from an unsolved crime. It is not the sharp, acute pain of the initial loss, though that pain is real and it is devastating. It is the chronic, grinding pain of unresolved injustice, the knowledge that the system failed, that the people who were supposed to protect your family did not, that the people who killed your mother and your siblings walked free, that they lived their lives, had their experiences, grew old, and died without ever being held accountable. That is what the Sharp family has lived with for more than 4 decades. Gamberg has said that the case is not over, that new evidence continues to emerge, that the DNA match to a living person of interest is real and significant, that the investigation is ongoing, and perhaps, in some future that none of us can predict, the case will finally be resolved. But for now, the Keddie murders remain officially what they have been since April 12th, 1981. Unsolved. As of the most recent public statements from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, the Keddie murders case remains open and actively investigated. Sheriff Greg Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg have both stated publicly that the investigation is ongoing and that new evidence continues to emerge. The key developments since the case was reopened in 2013 include the following: the discovery of the hammer in a pond near the Keddie Resort in 2016. Matching the description of the hammer Smart claimed went missing from his home. The recovery of a hunting knife in the Keddie area. The identification of new DNA evidence matching a living person of interest. The analysis of the anonymous tip tape from 1984, which had sat sealed and unexamined for nearly 30 years. And the identification of other living individuals who are believed to have information about the crime. These developments represent genuine progress. But progress is not resolution. No charges have been filed. No arrests have been made. No trial has been scheduled. The case remains, in the language of law enforcement, active but unsolved. The challenges facing the investigation at this point are formidable. The primary suspects are dead. Key witnesses have died or moved away. Physical evidence from 1981 has degraded or been lost. The chain of custody for much of the evidence has been broken. Cabin 28 has been demolished, and the institutional memory of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office has been almost entirely replaced, as the officers who were there in 1981 have retired, transferred, or passed away. But the case is not hopeless. DNA technology has advanced enormously since 1981. Techniques that did not exist 40 years ago can now extract usable genetic material from trace evidence. If the hammer, the knife, or other physical evidence yields DNA, it could provide the definitive link between the suspects and the crime scene that the original investigation failed to establish. The living person of interest, identified through DNA evidence, represents another potential avenue of resolution. If this individual can be persuaded to cooperate, or if the evidence against them is sufficient to support charges, the case could move forward. Even if formal prosecution is not possible, a cooperative witness could provide the testimony needed to officially close the case and name the perpetrators. And there is the matter of public accountability. Even without a trial, the accumulation of evidence, the letter, the counselor's testimony, the DNA, the physical evidence, the testimony of Marilyn Smart, constitutes a compelling case that is hard to ignore. It may not meet the legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, but it meets the standard of common sense. And for the surviving Sharp family, common sense may ultimately be more important than legal procedure. The Keddie case is a marathon, not a sprint. It has been running for more than 4 decades, and it may run for years more before it is finally resolved. But the people working on it, Gamberg, Hagwood, the citizen investigators, the surviving family members, have not given up. They continue to push, they continue to search, they continue to believe that the truth is out there, buried in evidence boxes and DNA databases, and the memories of people who have kept silent for far too long. And if this story teaches us anything, it is that some cases are never truly cold. They are only waiting for the right investigator, the right technology, the right moment, the right conscience to finally speak. The Keddie cabin murders are waiting, and the people who committed them, or who helped them, or who know what happened, should know that the waiting will not end. Not until the truth is told, not until justice in whatever form it takes is finally served. Let us consider for a moment what justice might mean in this case, because the conventional idea of justice, arrest, trial, conviction, sentencing may no longer be achievable. The 2 primary suspects are dead. Smart died in 2006 at the age of approximately 57. Bubede died in 1988. They will never stand trial. They will never face a jury. They will never hear a verdict read aloud in a courtroom. So what would justice look like for the Sharp family? Perhaps it would look like an official statement from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office naming Smart and Burbed as the perpetrators. Not a conviction, but a declaration, an acknowledgement on the record that the case has been solved in fact, if not in law, that the family's suffering was not random or meaningless, but the result of specific actions by specific people. Perhaps it would look like charges against any living persons of interest who were involved in or had knowledge of the crime. If the DNA evidence connects a living individual to the murders, and if that individual can be shown to have participated in or facilitated the crime, then criminal charges remain a possibility. The statute of limitations on murder does not expire. If someone alive today helped carry Tina's body to Butte County, or helped dispose of weapons, or helped the killers escape, they can still be prosecuted. Perhaps justice would look like a full accounting of the institutional failures that allowed this case to go unsolved. An acknowledgement from the DOJ that its handling of the investigation was inadequate. An explanation, even decades after the fact, of why organized crime agents were sent instead of homicide investigators. A reckoning with the decisions that were made and not made in the critical hours and days following the murders. Or perhaps justice, at this point, is simply the truth. The full, unvarnished, publicly stated truth about what happened in Cabin 28 on the night of April 11th, 1981. Who entered that cabin, what they did, why they did it, what happened to Tina, where the bodies were moved and by whom. The complete story, told without ambiguity or euphemism, in a way that honors the victims and acknowledges the suffering of the survivors. Sheila Sharp has said that she wants answers. She has spent more than 40 years waiting for them. And while no answer can restore what was taken from her, the truth, spoken aloud and officially recognized, would at least allow the wound to begin to close, would allow the grief to evolve from the acute, unresolved pain of an open case into the more bearable sorrow of a closed one. The truth will not bring Sue back. It will not bring John or Dana or Tina back. It will not give Sheila back her childhood or Rick and Greg their mother. But it would mean that their suffering was seen, that their loss was acknowledged, that the people who failed them were held to account, even if only in the court of public opinion. And that, perhaps, is the most any of us can ask for when the justice system has failed so completely and for so long. There is a question that hangs over this case like the fog that settles into the mountain valleys of the Sierra Nevada on cool mornings. Not who did it. We know, or we believe we know, with as much certainty as circumstantial evidence and near confessions can provide. Who did it? The question is something deeper and more troubling. The question is, why was it allowed to happen this way? Why was a man with organized crime connections living in a resort cabin in a remote mountain town never seriously investigated for murder? Why were the DOJ agents sent from the organized crime unit instead of the homicide division? Why was the most experienced homicide detective in the county excluded from the case? Why was a near confession letter overlooked for 30 years? Why was an anonymous tip tape sealed and forgotten? Why were the prime suspects allowed to simply leave town? Why was a bloody knife found in a trash bin and never analyzed? Why were composite sketches drawn by an untrained amateur when federal forensic artists were available? Each of these questions, taken alone, could be explained by incompetence. Rural departments are under-resourced. Mistakes happen. People fall through the cracks, but taken together, the pattern of failures is so consistent and so systematic that it begins to look less like incompetence and more like something deliberate. Whether there was an actual cover-up, a conscious decision by law enforcement officials to protect one or both suspects from prosecution, is something that may never be definitively proven. But the circumstantial evidence for some form of interference is strong. Bubedi's organized crime connections, the DOJ's unusual decision to send organized crime agents, Sheriff Thomas's resignation and subsequent employment at the DOJ, the repeated failure to pursue obvious leads, the protection, whether active or passive, that seems to have been extended to the suspects. And behind all of these institutional failures are real people. Sue Sharp, who left an abusive marriage and moved across the country to protect her children, only to be murdered in the home she had chosen as their refuge. John Sharp, 15 years old, a Quincy High School student with his whole life ahead of him, killed because he happened to be in the living room that night. Dana Wingate, 17 years old, a boy who had come over to hang out with his friend and who had the terrible misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Tina Sharp, 12 years old, taken from her home in the middle of the night, murdered to prevent her from identifying the men who had killed her mother and left in the woods 60 miles away for 3 years before her remains were found by a stranger collecting bottles. These were people, not case numbers, not cold case files, not true crime content. People with names and faces and families and futures that were stolen from them. And the surviving children, Sheila, who found the bodies and spent her life raising her brothers. Rick, who slept through the murder of his family and has carried that strange, awful proximity ever since. Greg, who was 5 years old and who grew up knowing that his mother was killed in the room next to where he slept. Justin Smart, who was sleeping over at the Sharp house and who may have witnessed things that no 12-year-old should ever see, and who has spent his life caught between loyalty to his family and the weight of whatever he knows. These children did not choose this. They did not ask for it. They were not given a chance to prevent it. They were simply there, small and sleeping and innocent, on a night when the adults around them brought violence into their lives that can never be undone. To be fair, the Keddie case is not unique in its failures. Cold cases are, by definition, cases where the system did not work, and there are thousands of them, tens of thousands across the country, families waiting for answers, investigators doing their best with limited resources, evidence degrading, witnesses dying, time passing, the odds stacked against resolution with each year that goes by. But the Keddie case stands out because the answers were there. They were there from the beginning. The suspects were known. The evidence pointed to them. A letter was written. A counselor was told. A DNA match was eventually found. And yet, for more than 40 years, the machinery of justice has failed to produce a result. The community of Keddie has never recovered. The resort is gone. The cabins are gone. The bar is gone. The post office is gone. The general store is gone. What remains is a stretch of road, a few standing structures, and the memory of something that happened in a cabin that no longer exists on a night that no one who lived through it will ever forget. There is a Rod DeCroner, a patrol commander for the Plumas County Sheriff's Department, who has spoken about the case. He said that the fact that a crime involving 4 victims was a rare occurrence, and that he still feels a chill when patrolling the area. The murderer, he noted, remains unidentified in any official sense. The case is open. The file is active. The questions remain. And so tonight, as you settle into your bed, wherever you are, in whatever city or town or quiet place you call home, maybe take a moment to think about the people in this story, not the killers, not the institutional failures, not the conspiracy theories, or the organized crime connections, or the botched investigation. Think about Sue Sharp, who worked multiple jobs to feed her children and who gave up her own coat so they could have warm clothes for winter. Think about John, who was just a teenager figuring out life in a new town. Think about Dana, who was just a friend visiting a buddy, not knowing that the evening would be his last. Think about Tina, who was 12 years old, who had barely begun to discover who she was going to be. And think about Sheila and Rick and Greg, the children who survived, who grew up in the long, cold shadow of that April night, who have carried this weight for more than 40 years, who are still here, still waiting, still hoping that someday the truth will be spoken aloud in a courtroom and that the people who failed their family will finally have to answer for it. Because behind every cold case, behind every file folder, and every sealed evidence bag, and every unsolved crime number, there is a family. There are children who lost their parents. There are siblings who lost each other. There are questions that keep people awake at night, year after year, decade after decade. And if anyone out there has information about the Keddie cabin murders, if you know something, if you heard something, if you have been carrying a secret about that night for 40 years, please contact the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. It is not too late. It may never be too late for the truth. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm bed with your phone beside you and your ceiling fan humming and your blankets pulled up to your chin, maybe close your eyes and hold a quiet thought for the Sharp family, for a mother who tried, for children who endured, for a tiny town in the mountains that never quite recovered from a night in April. Good night. Sleep well. And if you are still awake, know that these stories matter, that the people in them mattered, and that telling their stories carefully and with respect is one small way of refusing to let them be forgotten. That is the Keddie cabin murders. That is the story of Cabin 28. Quiet, devastating, unresolved. And that, too, is history. The Keddie cabin murders have become part of the dark folklore of Northern California. They are mentioned alongside other notorious unsolved cases. They are discussed on podcasts and in web forums and in documentaries. They are, in the particular way that true crime cases become cultural artifacts, known. But knowing about a case and understanding it are different things. The Keddie murders are not just a mystery to be solved or a puzzle to be assembled from clues and theories. They are a story about real people, about a mother who tried to save her children and was murdered for it, about a teenage boy and his friend who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, about a 12-year-old girl who was stolen from her family and left in the woods, about children who survived and had to find a way to live in a world that had shown them its worst face. The Keddie case is also a story about institutions and their failures, about the gap between what the justice system promises and what it delivers, about the way that power and connections can shield the guilty while the innocent suffer, about the limitations of rural law enforcement and the consequences of those limitations for the people who depend on it. And it is a story about persistence, about Sheila Sharp, who has never stopped fighting for answers, about Mike Gamberg, who waited decades to work the case and who has pursued it with a tenacity that borders on obsession, about the citizen investigators who kept the case alive during the years when no one in authority seemed to care, about a community that, despite its wounds, has not forgotten. The lesson of the Keddie cabin murders, if there is one, is that some stories refuse to end until they are properly told. that some injustices are too deep to be buried by time, that some families are too strong to be silenced by institutional indifference, and that the truth, even when it has been hidden for decades, has a way of surfacing, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, but inevitably. The Keddie case is not over. The investigation continues. The evidence accumulates. The DNA is being tested. The living persons of interest are known. And somewhere, perhaps in a file cabinet, in the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, perhaps in the memory of someone who has been carrying a secret for 40 years, the answer exists, complete and undeniable, waiting to be spoken aloud. And until it is, the people who care about this case, the family, the investigators, the researchers, the listeners, will keep waiting, will keep asking, will keep refusing to look away, because Sue Sharp and John Sharp and Dana Wingate and Tina Sharp deserve that. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be mourned. And they deserve, finally, after all these years, to be avenged. Not with violence, not with vengeance, but with the truth, spoken plainly, without flinching, in a courtroom or in the pages of an official report, or in the quiet acknowledgement of a community that has finally, after 4 decades, been allowed to heal. That is what the Keddie Cabin murders mean. That is what they teach. And that is why we tell these stories. Not for entertainment, not for shock value, but because these people mattered. Their lives mattered. Their deaths mattered. And the failure to solve their murders matters. Tonight, hold them gently in your thoughts. And then, when sleep comes, let it come. Tomorrow is a new day, and every new day brings the possibility that this case, at long last, will find its ending. Good night.